In 1870s Wyoming, a widow named Mabel Rourke found herself cast out into the wilderness with her two young sons after her husband's death. The Rourke family, wealthy ranch owners, wanted nothing to do with a woman they considered beneath their station. With only a mule cart and determination, Mabel faced the harsh frontier alone. When exhaustion and despair nearly claimed her on a dusty cattle trail, salvation came from an unexpected source. Will Calder, a struggling cowboy with barely enough land to graze his few cattle, offered what little he had. His broken-down barn became their sanctuary, and slowly, through shared hardship and quiet kindness, something beautiful began to grow. But peace never lasts long on the frontier. When the Rourke family discovered that Mabel's sons might hold the key to a valuable inheritance, they returned with a vengeance. What would a desperate mother do when everything she'd built was threatened once again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Rourke ranch as Mabel stood at the kitchen window, watching her two boys chase chickens in the yard. Samuel, 8 years old with his father's stubborn chin, herded the birds with the serious concentration of a seasoned rancher. Benjamin, barely 6, giggled as he stumbled after his older brother, his chubby legs working hard to keep up. The sight should have filled her with contentment, but instead, a familiar knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. 3 months had passed since Thomas's funeral, and the weight of unwelcome glances from his family had only grown heavier. She could feel their disapproval like a cold wind, even now as she prepared breakfast in what had once been her sanctuary. The kitchen, with its wide oak table and cheerful yellow curtains, had been her domain when Thomas was alive. Now it felt like borrowed space, and she the unwelcome guest. "Mama, Samuel won't let me hold the baby chick." Benjamin's voice carried through the window, high with indignation. "That's because you squeezed too hard," Samuel replied with the patient exasperation of an older brother. "You have to be gentle, like Papa taught us." The mention of their father sent a familiar ache through Mabel's chest. Thomas Rourke had been a gentle giant of a man, with hands that could rope a steer or cradle a newborn calf with equal skill. He'd chosen her over the protests of his family, seeing past her humble origins to something worth loving. The daughter of a struggling farmer, she'd never quite fit the mold of what the Rourke family expected in a wife for their heir. But Thomas hadn't cared about expectations. He'd courted her with wild flowers and shy smiles, building their life together one day at a time. When consumption took him last winter, she'd lost more than a husband. She'd lost her protector, her advocate, and her place in the world. The sound of boots on the porch interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Jeremiah Rourke approaching, his face set in the perpetual scowl that had become his default expression around her. Thomas's older brother had always resented her presence, but grief had transformed his cold disapproval into something sharper, more dangerous. "Mabel." His voice carried the chill of a Wyoming winter as he entered without knocking. "We need to talk." She turned from the window, smoothing her apron with hands that trembled slightly. "Of course, Jeremiah. Would you like some coffee?" "This isn't a social call." He remained standing, his tall frame filling the doorway like a storm cloud. "Constance and I have been discussing the situation, and we've come to a decision." The knot in her stomach tightened. Constance, Jeremiah's wife, had never bothered to hide her disdain for Mabel. A woman born into wealth and privilege, she viewed Mabel as an unfortunate reminder of Thomas's poor judgment. Her sharp tongue and calculating eyes had made many a family gathering uncomfortable, but lately her hostility had taken on a new edge. "What situation?" Mabel asked, though she suspected she knew. "This," Jeremiah gestured around the kitchen, "as if it were contaminated. You living here like you belong. Thomas is gone, Mabel. His obligation to you died with him." The words hit like physical blows, but Mabel forced herself to stand straighter. "This is my home, Jeremiah. These are my children's home. Thomas would want what's best for his sons," Jeremiah interrupted. "And what's best for them isn't being raised by a woman who can barely manage her own affairs, let alone prepare them for their responsibilities as Rorks." "I've managed just fine these past months," Mabel said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil in her chest. "The boys are happy, healthy. The boys are growing wild," Jeremiah cut her off. "Samuel should be learning his letters and numbers, preparing for his future role in the ranch. Instead, he's playing with chickens like a common farm child. And Benjamin," he shook his head in disgust, "the boy can barely speak properly. How do you expect him to take his place in society?" Heat flared in Mabel's cheeks. "They're children, Jeremiah. They've lost their father. They need time to grieve, to heal. What they need is proper guidance." Jeremiah's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Constance has found an excellent boarding school back east. The boys will receive the education and refinement they deserve, far from influences that might hold them back." The blood drained from Mabel's face. "You want to send them away?" "I want to give them opportunities you never could." Jeremiah's eyes were cold as winter steel. "They're Rorks, Mabel. They deserve better than this provincial life." "They deserve their mother," Mabel said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "They deserve to know where they come from, to understand their father's love for this land." "Their father's love nearly bankrupted this ranch," Jeremiah snapped. "His sentimental attachments to lost causes and inappropriate people cost us contracts, respect, opportunities. I won't watch his sons follow the same path." The cruelty of his words took Mabel's breath away. Thomas had been the kindest man she'd ever known, seeing potential in people others dismissed, extending help to those who needed it most. His generosity had been a source of strength, not weakness, and she'd loved him all the more for it. "Thomas built this ranch into something beautiful," she said quietly. "He saw value in things others overlooked, including me, and look where that got him," Jeremiah replied without mercy. "Dead at 35, leaving behind a widow who can't even properly discipline her children and 2 boys who'll grow up thinking sentiment matters more than success." The kitchen door swung open, and Constance entered with the measured steps of a woman surveying her domain. Tall and elegant, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Her pale blue eyes swept over Mabel with the same expression she might use to examine a piece of inferior merchandise. "I see you've started the conversation," Constance said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern finishing schools. "Good. We have arrangements to make." "I haven't agreed to anything," Mabel said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Constance's smile was sharp as a blade. "My dear, you seem to misunderstand. We're not asking for your permission. We're informing you of our decision. Those are my children. Those are Rorke heirs," Constance interrupted smoothly. "And as such, they require proper guidance. You've done your best, I'm sure, but your best simply isn't adequate for children of their station." Mabel felt the walls of her world closing in. Thomas wanted them raised here, on the land he loved. He wanted them to know their heritage. Thomas wanted many things that weren't practical, Jeremiah said dismissively. His romantic notions don't change reality. The boys need education, refinement, connections. They need to learn what it means to be men of substance. "And what about what I need?" Mabel asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "What about what they need from their mother?" Constance's laugh was like ice breaking on a frozen pond. "My dear child, you're not thinking clearly. What could you possibly offer them that we cannot provide? We have wealth, position, influence. We can open doors for them that you couldn't even imagine." "I can offer them love," Mabel said simply. "Love doesn't pay for education," Jeremiah replied. "Love doesn't build business connections or secure advantageous marriages. Love is a luxury we can't afford." The boys' laughter drifted through the window, innocent and carefree. Mabel's heart clenched as she imagined them torn from everything familiar, sent away to strangers who would shape them into something their father never intended them to become. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for begging but unable to stop. "Don't do this. They need stability, not more upheaval. They need their mother. What they need," Constance said with finality, "is to be raised by people who understand their destiny. You've had 3 months to prove yourself capable, Mabel. The results speak for themselves." "I need time to think." "Time is a luxury we don't have," Jeremiah interrupted. "The school requires 6 weeks' notice, and the arrangements are already in motion. The boys will leave at the end of the month." The words hit Mabel like a physical blow. 4 weeks. In 4 weeks her children would be gone, shipped off to strangers who would mold them into versions of themselves she might not recognize. The thought was unbearable. "And what about me?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Jeremiah and Constance exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "You'll be provided for, of course," Constance said with the tone of someone discussing a troublesome servant. "There's a small cottage in town that should suit your needs. You'll have a modest allowance, enough to live quietly and comfortably, away from my children, away from responsibilities you're not equipped to handle," Jeremiah corrected. "You can visit them during school holidays, naturally. Supervised visits to ensure their education isn't undermined." Mabel felt something die inside her chest. The life she'd built, the family she'd treasured, the future she'd envisioned. All of it crumbling like a house built on sand. The boys' laughter outside seemed to mock her helplessness, a reminder of everything she was about to lose. "I won't let you do this," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You have no choice," Constance replied with brutal honesty. "You have no legal standing, no financial resources, no support. Thomas left the ranch to his family, not to you. Your only claim here died with him." The truth of it settled over Mabel like a shroud. She'd known this day would come, had felt it approaching, like a storm on the horizon. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. The reality of her powerlessness was more devastating than she'd imagined. "Think of what's best for the boys," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying a hint of what might have been sympathy. "They deserve every advantage we can give them. Your love for them should make you want that too." But as Mabel looked out the window at her sons, still chasing chickens with the pure joy of childhood, she wondered if advantages were worth the price of innocence. Would Samuel's serious concentration bloom into wisdom, or would it harden into the cold calculation she saw in Jeremiah's eyes? Would Benjamin's laughter survive the refinement process, or would it be educated out of him like a bad habit? The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock Thomas had given her for their first anniversary. Time moving forward, carrying them all toward a future she couldn't control and didn't want to face. In 4 weeks, everything would change. In 4 weeks, she would lose the only family she had left. The weight of that knowledge settled into her bones like winter. Cold, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Mabel Rourke truly understood what it meant to be alone. The morning of reckoning arrived, with unseasonable cold, as if nature itself conspired to match the chill in Mabel's heart. She'd spent the previous 3 weeks in a fog of desperate planning, writing letters to distant relatives who never responded, seeking counsel from the local pastor, who offered only prayers, and watching her boys with the aching awareness of borrowed time. Now, as she stood in the kitchen that had once been her sanctuary, Mabel faced the formal document that would tear her world apart. The eviction notice lay spread across the oak table like a death warrant, its legal language cold and impersonal. Jeremiah stood beside it, his face set in the hard lines of a man conducting unpleasant but necessary business. "I trust you've had time to review the paperwork," he said, adjusting his gold pocket watch with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his will obeyed. "Everything is in order." Mabel's hands trembled as she picked up the document. The words swam before her eyes, but their meaning was crystal clear. She and her children were to vacate the premises within 24 hours. 24 hours to abandon the only home her boys had ever known. "This is unnecessary, Jeremiah," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I told you I would make arrangements to leave quietly. There's no need for legal threats. Legal clarity protects everyone involved," Constance interjected from her position by the window, where she'd been observing the proceedings with the detached interest of someone watching a mildly entertaining play. "We cannot have any confusion about the family's intentions or your status here." The word status hit Mabel like a slap. In Constance's mouth, it carried the weight of everything Mabel had never been and never would be. Worthy, acceptable. "Enough. My status is the mother of your nephews," Mabel replied, a spark of defiance flickering through her despair. "That should count for something in this family." Jeremiah's expression hardened. "Your status is that of Thomas's widow, nothing more. And widows, particularly those without means or connections, have no place making demands in matters beyond their understanding." The casual cruelty of his words took Mabel's breath away. Thomas would have been horrified to hear his brother speak this way, but Thomas was gone, and with him any protection she might have claimed. "I'm not making demands," Mabel said quietly. "I'm asking for mercy, for consideration of what's best. For Samuel and Benjamin, what's best for them is what we've already arranged," Constance said with finality. "The Whitmore Academy has an excellent reputation. The boys will receive the finest education, proper social connections, and the refinement necessary for their future roles." "Their future roles as what?" Mabel asked, desperation making her bold. "As men who've forgotten where they came from, who've never known their mother's love." "As men who understand their responsibilities," Jeremiah replied coldly. "As men who won't make the same sentimental mistakes their father made." The insult to Thomas's memory hit Mabel like a physical blow, but before she could respond, the kitchen door burst open and Samuel rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama! Benjamin found a baby owl that fell from its nest," he announced, breathlessly. "Can we keep it? I promise I'll take care of it," and he stopped abruptly, sensing the tension in the room. His bright eyes moved from his mother's pale face to his uncle's stern expression, and his excitement faded into uncertainty. "Samuel," Mabel said gently, "go find your brother and wait for me on the porch." "But Mama, the owl—" "Now, Samuel," she said more firmly, though her heart broke at the confusion in his young face. The boy hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but something in his mother's tone convinced him to obey. He cast one last uncertain glance at the adults before heading back outside, his footsteps heavy with the weight of childhood intuition that something was terribly wrong. "Even now," Constance observed once the boy was gone, "you can see the lack of proper discipline. That child should have greeted his elders respectfully before launching into his childish concerns." "He's 8 years old," Mabel said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He's excited about helping an injured animal. Thomas would have been proud of his compassion." "Thomas indulged too many things that should have been corrected," Jeremiah replied dismissively. "It's exactly this kind of misguided sentiment that convinces us we're making the right choice." Mabel stared at him, seeing for the first time not just his coldness, but the fundamental difference between him and the man she'd married. Thomas had possessed a warmth that drew people to him, a genuine concern for those around him that had made him beloved by his workers and respected by his neighbors. Jeremiah, she realized, had none of his brother's capacity for love. "Sign the document, Mabel," Jeremiah said, pulling out an expensive fountain pen. "Make this easy on everyone, especially the boys." "And if I refuse?" Constance's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Then we'll have the sheriff remove you forcibly, and the boys will witness their mother being dragged away in disgrace. Is that really the final memory you want to give them of their life here?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Mabel could picture it all too clearly. Samuel and Benjamin watching in terror as their mother was taken away, their last moments in their childhood home tainted with violence and shame. The image was unbearable. "Where am I supposed to go?" Mabel asked, hating the desperation in her voice. "What am I supposed to do with nothing but the clothes on our backs?" "That's hardly our concern," Jeremiah replied with brutal honesty. "You had 3 months to make alternative arrangements. Your failure to plan ahead is not our responsibility." "I was grieving my husband," Mabel said, anger finally breaking through her careful composure. "I was helping my children cope with losing their father. I was trying to hold together what little remained of our family. And now it's time to face reality," Constance said without sympathy. "Reality is that you have no claim here, no means of support, and no ability to provide for those children the way they deserve. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone." Mabel looked around the kitchen one last time, seeing it not as it was now, but as it had been during the happy years with Thomas. She remembered winter mornings when he'd sneak down early to start the fire, leaving the room warm for her and the boys. She remembered lazy Sunday afternoons when they'd all gathered around the table for long meals filled with laughter and planning for the future. She remembered the night Thomas had carried a feverish Benjamin around this very room, singing softly until the baby's fever broke. All of it was ending. All of it would soon belong to someone else, become just another room in Jeremiah and Constance's cold, efficient world. "The wagon is loaded with your personal belongings," Jeremiah said, consulting his pocket watch again. "I took the liberty of having the hands pack everything this morning while you were in town. Nothing that belongs to the ranch, of course, but your clothes, the boys' things, a few pieces of furniture that Thomas specifically left to you in his will." Mabel's head snapped up. "What wagon?" "The one waiting outside," Constance said with false brightness. "We've been quite generous, actually. Most of the furniture has no real value, and the clothes, well, they'll need replacing eventually anyway." The casual dismissal of her life's possessions hit Mabel like another blow. These people had been in her home, touching her things, deciding what held value and what didn't, packing away her existence like unwanted household goods. "You had no right," she whispered. "We had every right," Jeremiah corrected. "This is our property now, and we're well within our legal authority to dispose of its contents as we see fit." Through the window, Mabel could see an old mule cart loaded with boxes and bundles, looking pathetically small against the vast backdrop of the ranch. Everything she and Thomas had built together, everything that remained of their life, reduced to a single cartload of belongings. "Mama?" Benjamin's voice came from the doorway, high and uncertain. "Samuel says we have to go somewhere. Is that true?" Mabel's heart shattered completely at the confusion in her youngest son's voice. At 6 years old, Benjamin had barely begun to understand that his father wasn't coming back. Now he faced another incomprehensible loss, another upheaval in his small world. "Yes, sweetheart," she managed to say. "We're going on a trip." "Where are we going?" Benjamin asked, moving to her side and slipping his small hand into hers. "I don't know yet," Mabel admitted, the honesty tearing at her throat. "But we'll be together, and that's what matters." "Will Uncle Jeremiah and Aunt Constance come with us?" Benjamin asked, with the innocent hope of a child who couldn't yet understand adult cruelty. "No, darling," Mabel said softly. "They'll be staying here." "But who will take care of the ranch?" Benjamin's logical mind was trying to make sense of the situation. "Papa said the ranch needs taking care of. Your uncle will take care of it now," Mabel explained, though the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "But Papa said it was our ranch." Benjamin persisted. He said someday me and Samuel would help him run it. Jeremiah shifted uncomfortably, and for just a moment Mabel thought she saw a flicker of something that might have been shame cross his features. But it passed quickly, replaced by his usual stern resolve. "Plans change, Benjamin," Constance said with forced patience. "Your father made many promises he couldn't keep. The cruelty of dismissing Thomas's dreams in front of his son was breathtaking. But Mabel forced herself to focus on what mattered most, getting her children away from this place before any more damage was done. "Go get your brother," she told Benjamin gently. "Tell him it's time to say goodbye." As the little boy ran off to find Samuel, Mabel turned back to the document on the table. The pen felt impossibly heavy in her hand as she signed her name. Each letter another nail in the coffin of her old life. "Wise choice," Jeremiah said, folding the papers with obvious satisfaction. "The wagon is yours to keep, along with the mule. Consider it our parting gift." A parting gift, as if 24 hours. Notice and a broken-down cart could somehow compensate for the loss of home, security, and belonging. Mabel said nothing, knowing that any response would only invite more cruelty. The boys appeared in the doorway, Samuel holding Benjamin's hand with the protective instinct of an older brother. Both children looked confused and frightened, clearly, sensing that something momentous was happening but unable to understand what. "Are we really leaving, Mama?" Samuel asked, his young voice trying to be brave. "Yes, sweetheart," Mabel confirmed, gathering her boys to her side. "We're going to find a new place to live." "But I don't want a new place," Benjamin said, tears beginning to slide down his cheeks. "I want to stay here with Papa." "Papa isn't here anymore, remember?" Samuel said gently to his brother, though his own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Mama said he went to heaven. Then why can't we stay here and wait for him to come back?" Benjamin asked with the heartbreaking logic of a child who didn't yet understand the finality of death. Mabel knelt down to their level, gathering both boys in her arms. "Sometimes we have to leave places we love," she said softly. "But we take the love with us, and that makes any place feel like home." It was a beautiful sentiment, but as Mabel looked into her children's frightened faces, she wondered if she was lying to them. Could love really be enough when they had nowhere to go and no means of survival? Could she truly make a home for them with nothing but determination and the few belongings in that pathetic cart? "Say goodbye to the house," she told them gently. "Thank it for keeping us safe and warm." The boys obeyed with the solemnity of children who sensed the gravity of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand it. They touched the kitchen walls, whispered goodbyes to their bedrooms, and stood for a long moment in the doorway of the room that had been their father's study. When they finally climbed into the cart, Benjamin immediately began to cry in earnest. Samuel tried to comfort him while fighting his own tears, and Mabel felt her heart break all over again at her oldest son's attempt to be strong. "Where will we go, Mama?" Samuel asked as she took up the reins. "West," Mabel said, because it was the only direction that didn't hold memories of the life they were leaving behind. "We'll go west and see what we find." As the cart pulled away from the ranch house, Mabel didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see Jeremiah and Constance watching from the windows, satisfied with their cruel efficiency. Instead, she focused on the road ahead, on the vast Wyoming territory that stretched beyond the horizon, on the impossible task of building a new life from nothing. Behind them, the ranch grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the last remnants of the world Thomas Rourke had built for his family. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and the terrifying prospect of survival in a land that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. But as the miles passed and her children's tears gradually subsided into exhausted sleep against her shoulders, Mabel made herself a promise. Whatever it took, however hard the journey became, she would find a way to give her boys the love and security they deserved. She would prove that a mother's devotion was worth more than all of Jeremiah's cold calculations. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and that at least was something no legal document could take away. The Wyoming frontier stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast canvas of rolling hills and endless sky that seemed to mock the smallness of their mule cart. 3 days had passed since they'd left the ranch. 3 days of bone-jarring travel, over rutted trails that barely deserved the name of roads. The late autumn air carried the promise of winter, and Mabel pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she guided their tired mule toward what she hoped might be shelter for the night. Samuel sat beside her on the wagon seat, his 8-year-old frame trying to mirror her determined posture. In his lap, he cradled the wooden horse his father had carved for him last Christmas, a simple toy that had become his most treasured possession. The careful way he held it, protecting it from every bump and jolt of the cart, broke Mabel's heart. Anew, it was all he had left of the father who would never carve him another. "Mama, my stomach hurts," Benjamin whispered from the back of the cart, where he lay curled among their belongings. The 6-year-old had been unusually quiet since morning, and when Mabel turned to check on him, she saw the telltale flush of fever across his pale cheeks. "Just a little longer, sweetheart," she said, though she had no idea where they were going or how much longer their journey might last. The truth was, they were lost, not just geographically, but in every way that mattered. She had no destination, no plan beyond the desperate hope that something would present itself before their meager supplies ran out entirely. "Is Benjamin sick?" Samuel asked, his young voice heavy with worry that no child should have to carry. "He's just tired," Mabel replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We all are." But as the afternoon wore on, Benjamin's condition worsened. His quiet whimpers turned to restless tossing, and when Mabel stopped the cart to check on him, his skin was burning with fever. Fear clawed at her chest as she realized they were facing a crisis she was utterly unprepared to handle. "We need to find shelter," she told Samuel, who had climbed into the back to comfort his little brother. "Somewhere warm and dry where Benjamin can rest." Samuel nodded solemnly, his serious brown eyes reflecting an understanding far beyond his years. "Papa used to say that when you're lost, you should look for high ground to see where you're going." The wisdom of it struck Mabel with fresh grief. Thomas had been teaching his sons to survive in this harsh land, preparing them for challenges he'd never imagined they would face without him. She guided the mule toward a small rise ahead, hoping against hope that it might reveal some sign of civilization. From the hilltop, the view was both breathtaking and terrifying. The wilderness stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the silver thread of a distant river and the faint line of what might have been a trail. No smoke from cabin chimneys, no fence lines marking settled land, no signs of human habitation anywhere. "There," Samuel said suddenly, pointing toward the northwest. "Mama, look there." Following his gaze, Mabel saw what looked like a dark smudge against the pale grass, too regular to be natural, too distant to make out clearly. But it was something, and something was better than the nothing they'd been traveling toward. "Good eyes, sweetheart," she said, turning the cart in that direction. "Your father would be proud." The mention of Thomas brought a small smile to Samuel's face, the first she'd seen since they'd left the ranch. It gave her hope that somewhere beneath the weight of loss and uncertainty, her boys were still there, still capable of joy, still able to look forward rather than back. But as they drew closer to the dark smudge, Mabel's heart sank. It was indeed a structure, but barely that. A half-collapsed cabin with a roof that had mostly fallen in and walls that wouldn't keep out the wind, let alone the cold rain that was beginning to fall. "We can't stay here," Samuel observed, displaying the practical mind that reminded her so much of his father. "Benjamin needs someplace warm." "I know," Mabel said, fighting down a wave of despair. The light was fading fast, and Benjamin's condition was getting worse. They needed shelter, food, and help, none of which seemed likely to appear in this desolate landscape. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of hoofbeats reached them across the prairie. Mabel's first instinct was fear. Out here, strangers could mean danger, especially for a woman alone with 2 small children. But as a rider crested the hill behind them, something in his posture spoke of weariness rather than threat. The man who approached was perhaps 35, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places but cared for. Most importantly, he rode with the easy grace of someone at home on the frontier, someone who might know where a desperate family could find help. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he drew near. "You folks having trouble?" Mabel hesitated, torn between relief at finding another human being and caution about revealing their vulnerability. But Benjamin's fevered whimpering made the decision for her. "My son is sick," she said simply. "We need shelter for the night, somewhere warm and dry." The stranger's eyes moved from her face to the cart, taking in their obviously dire circumstances without comment or judgment. "There's a trading post about 5 miles south," he said. "They've got a doctor passing through, and May Hutchins keeps a clean place. Your boy would be safe there." "Thank you," Mabel said, the words inadequate for the relief flooding through her. "We're grateful for the information. I'll ride with you part way," the man offered. "Trail can be tricky in the dark, and it looks like weather's coming in." As they traveled together, the stranger, who introduced himself as Tom Mitchell, proved to be a gentle presence. He kept up a steady stream of conversation with Samuel, asking about the wooden horse and sharing stories of his own childhood on a farm in Kansas. His easy manner helped distract from Benjamin's worsening condition and the increasingly ominous clouds gathering overhead. "Your papa make that horse for you?" Tom asked, nodding toward the toy Samuel clutched protectively. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied quietly. "It was my Christmas present. He said every cowboy needs a good horse." "Wise man, your papa," Tom said seriously. "Can see he taught you to take care of what matters." The simple validation brought tears to Mabel's eyes. For days, she'd felt like a failure, unable to provide for her children, unable to find direction or purpose. But this stranger saw value in what Thomas had taught them, dignity in their circumstances despite their desperate state. When they reached a fork in the trail, Tom pointed toward the southern route. "Follow that path about 3 miles. You'll see the light from the trading post. Tell May that Tom Mitchell sent you. She'll take good care of you and the boy." "How can we repay your kindness?" Mabel asked, knowing they had nothing to offer but gratitude. Tom's smile was warm despite the gathering dusk. "Pass it along someday when you're able. That's how we survive out here, looking out for each other." As he rode away into the darkness, Mabel felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the ranch. Hope, not for rescue or easy solutions, but for the possibility that good people still existed in the world, that kindness wasn't extinct even in this harsh land. The trading post, when they finally reached it, proved to be exactly what Tom had promised. May Hutchins, a sturdy woman with graying hair and kind eyes, took one look at Benjamin's flushed face and immediately went into action. Within minutes, the sick little boy was tucked into a warm bed while the visiting doctor examined him with gentle efficiency. "Just a fever," the doctor pronounced after a thorough examination. "Common enough when children are under stress. Rest, fluids and warmth should set him right in a day or two." The relief was overwhelming. Mabel sank into a chair beside Benjamin's bed, feeling the tension of the past days finally begin to release its grip on her shoulders. Samuel curled up on a nearby cot, his wooden horse clutched to his chest, and for the first time since leaving the ranch, both boys slept peacefully. "You look like you could use some rest yourself," May observed, setting a cup of hot coffee in Mabel's hands. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Mabel couldn't remember. The past days had blurred together in a haze of worry and uncertainty, punctuated only by the basic necessities of keeping the boys fed and the mule moving. She'd given them the best of their small store of food, leaving little for herself. "We can't afford," she began, but May waved away her concerns. "We'll settle accounts later," the older woman said firmly. "Right now you need food and rest. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." As Mabel sipped the coffee and felt real warmth seep into her bones for the first time in days, she allowed herself to think beyond the immediate crisis. They couldn't stay here indefinitely. May ran a business, not a charity. But perhaps, with Benjamin recovering and their immediate needs met, she could find work, make plans, build some kind of foundation for their future. The wooden horse caught her eye from where Samuel had placed it carefully on the bedside table. Such a simple thing, carved from a scrap of wood during a quiet evening by the fire, but it represented everything Thomas had tried to give his sons: love, security, the promise of a future filled with possibility. She might not be able to give them the ranch or the inheritance Jeremiah had stolen from them. She might not be able to provide them with wealth or social position, but she could give them what Thomas had valued most: the knowledge that they were loved, the understanding that family was about more than blood or money, the certainty that they would always have each other. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying the promise of a harsh winter ahead. But inside the warm trading post, with her boys safe and sleeping, Mabel allowed herself to believe that they might just survive whatever challenges lay ahead. They had lost everything they'd thought they needed, but perhaps what they truly needed was simpler than she'd imagined: love, courage, and the kindness of strangers like Tom Mitchell and May Hutchins. It wasn't much to build a new life on, but it was a start. And sometimes, Mabel reflected as sleep finally claimed her, a start was all you needed. Benjamin's fever broke on the second morning, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time since they'd begun their journey. Mabel sat beside his bed in the small room above May Hutchins' trading post, watching color return to her youngest son's cheeks as he sipped the broth May had prepared with the practiced care of a woman who'd mothered half the territory. "I'm hungry, Mama," Benjamin announced, his voice still hoarse but wonderfully familiar. "Really, really hungry." "That's the best news I've heard in days," Mabel said, smoothing his dark hair away from his forehead. The simple gesture reminded her of countless mornings when Thomas had done the same thing, checking for fever during the boys' childhood illnesses with the gentle touch of a devoted father. Samuel looked up from the corner where he'd been quietly playing with his wooden horse, his face breaking into the first genuine smile she'd seen since leaving the ranch. "Can Benjamin have some of May's biscuits? She said they're good for growing boys." "I think that can be arranged," Mabel replied, her heart lifting at the normalcy of the request. For 3 days, her world had narrowed to the terrifying basics of survival, finding shelter, keeping her children safe, not knowing what tomorrow might bring. Now faced with something as simple as a hungry child asking for biscuits, she felt almost giddy with relief. May appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by their conversation, carrying a tray laden with warm food that made Benjamin's eyes widen with anticipation. "Thought I heard voices up here," she said, settling the tray on the bedside table. "Nothing like a good appetite to show a fever's truly broken." "Mrs. Hutchins, we can't continue to impose on your kindness," Mabel began, but the older woman cut her off with a firm shake of her head. "Nonsense. You're paying customers, even if the payment's been delayed a bit." May's eyes held a warmth that softened her practical words. "Besides, I've enjoyed having young ones around the place. Gets quiet here between the supply runs, but..." Mabel knew they couldn't stay much longer. Their small store of money, the few dollars Thomas had kept in a tobacco tin for emergencies, was nearly exhausted. She'd counted and recounted the coins, trying to stretch them far enough to cover their stay, but arithmetic was unforgiving. They had perhaps enough for one more night, and then they'd be truly destitute. "May," she said quietly, while the boys were distracted by the food, "I need to ask about work. Anything you might need done around here, cleaning, cooking, mending. I'm willing to do whatever's necessary." The older woman studied her with keen eyes that seemed to see more than Mabel was comfortable revealing. "What's your story, child?" "A woman doesn't end up on the frontier with 2 young ones and a mule cart without there being more to tell." Mabel hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something in May's manner, a combination of practical kindness and genuine concern, convinced her that honesty might be safer than half-truths. "My husband died last winter," she said simply. "His family decided his children would be better off in boarding school back east, and I wasn't welcome to stay on the ranch." May's expression darkened. Family threw you out, did they? And wanted to take the boys away from their mother. They said it was for the children's benefit. Better education, social connections, opportunities. I couldn't provide. Mabel's voice carried the weight of months of self-doubt. Maybe they were right. Horse feathers, May said with surprising vehemence. I've seen enough of this world to know that love and a steady hand matter more than all the fancy schooling money can buy. Those boys need their mother, not some stranger, in a starched collar, teaching them to be ashamed of where they come from. The fierce defense from this woman she barely knew brought tears to Mabel's eyes. For months, she'd internalized Jeremiah and Constance's criticisms, wondering if she truly was inadequate to raise her own children properly. The truth is, May continued, lowering her voice, I could use help around here. My arthritis has been acting up something fierce, and the busy season's coming with the supply trains. Can you cook for a crowd? Handle the cleaning and washing? Yes, Mabel said quickly, hope flaring in her chest. I managed a household staff of 6 at the ranch. I can cook, clean, do accounts if needed. What about the boys? They'll need schooling. I taught school before I married, Mabel replied. I can handle their education myself. May nodded approvingly. Then we might have an arrangement, room and board for you and the boys, plus a small wage in exchange for help running this place. What do you say? The offer was more generous than Mabel had dared hope for. But something held her back from immediate acceptance. Why would you do this for strangers? May's smile carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Because 20 years ago, I was in your shoes. My first husband died in a mining accident, left me with nothing but debts and a baby on the way. Took the kindness of strangers to get me back on my feet. Now I've got this place, a good life, and the means to help when I see someone. Who needs it? I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, May interrupted with a chuckle. Wait until you've spent a week dealing with drunken trappers and demanding travelers. You might change your mind about the blessing of steady work. But as Mabel looked around the clean, comfortable room and listened to her boys chattering happily over their breakfast, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of belonging somewhere. It wasn't the grand ranch house she'd lost, but it was honest work in the company of good people, and that was more than she'd dared hope for. Mama, Samuel said, looking up from his plate with syrup on his chin, May says there are other children who come through here with the wagon trains. She says I could teach Benjamin his letters while you work. The boy's eagerness to help, to take on responsibilities beyond his years, both proud and heartbroken her. At 8, he was already trying to fill the role his father's death had left, vacant, stepping up to protect and provide for his family in the ways available to him. That's very thoughtful, sweetheart, Mabel said, reaching over to wipe the syrup from his face. But you're still a little boy yourself. You should have time to play, not just work. Papa said work isn't just about earning money, Samuel replied seriously. He said it's about taking care of the people you love and doing your part to make things better. The echo of Thomas's values in his son's young voice was both comforting and painful. Her husband had been preparing his boys to be good men, teaching them that character mattered more than wealth or status. Perhaps that was a legacy worth more than any inheritance Jeremiah could have provided. Your papa was a wise man, May observed. Sounds like he raised his sons right. He was the best papa in the whole world, Benjamin declared with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old. He could rope a calf and sing lullabies and make the best pancakes on Sunday mornings. I'll bet he could, May said gently. And I'll bet he'd be mighty proud of how brave you boys have been, taking care of your mama on this big adventure. The word adventure reframed their desperate flight in terms that made the boys sit up straighter, seeing themselves not as refugees but as explorers. It was a kindness Mabel hadn't expected, this gift of dignity in the midst of their reduced circumstances. Over the following days, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Mabel threw herself into the work of running the trading. post, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. The boys helped where they could, Samuel proving remarkably good at arithmetic when helping with inventory, Benjamin charming the customers with his cheerful chatter. But it was in the quiet evening hours, when the boys were asleep and she sat by the fire with May, that Mabel began to truly heal. The older woman had a gift for listening without judgment, offering wisdom without preaching, and gradually drawing out the pain Mabel had been carrying alone. "You're not the first woman to lose everything and have to start over," May said one evening as they mended shirts by lamplight. "Won't be the last either. But what matters isn't what you've lost, it's what you do with what you've got left." "Some days I wonder if I'm being selfish," Mabel admitted. "Jeremiah and Constance could give the boys advantages I never could. Money, education, social position, and what would they take away?" May interrupted. "Their mother's love? Their father's values? Their understanding of what really matters in this life?" Mabel considered this as she worked her needle through the worn fabric. Thomas always said that a man's character was more important than his bank account. Smart man. And from what I can see, his boys are learning that lesson well. Samuel's got a good heart and a steady head on his shoulders. Benjamin's got the kind of joy that lights up a room. You think some fancy boarding school would improve on that? The question hung in the air as Mabel reflected on the boys she'd seen from wealthy families, polished and educated, but often cold, calculating, lacking the warmth and genuine compassion that made her sons special. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it would." "Then stop second-guessing yourself," May said firmly. "You're doing right by those boys, and anyone who can't see that isn't worth your worry." As the weeks passed, Mabel began to believe May's words. The boys thrived in their new environment, finding joy in simple pleasures they'd never appreciated before. Samuel discovered a love of reading from May's small but treasured collection of books. Benjamin made friends with every traveler who passed through, collecting stories and songs that filled their evenings with laughter. But it was Samuel's relationship with his wooden horse that showed Mabel most clearly how much they'd all grown. The toy was still precious to him, still carefully protected, but he'd begun sharing it with other children, explaining its significance and his father's craftsmanship with pride rather than possessive fear. "Papa would want other children to see it," he explained one evening when Mabel found him showing the horse to a young girl whose family was passing through. "He always said sharing good things makes them better, not worse." Watching her son's generosity, Mabel realized that Thomas's greatest gift hadn't been the ranch or the money or the social position. It had been his values, his understanding of what truly mattered, his example of how to live with integrity and compassion. Those things couldn't be taken away by cruel relatives or legal documents. They lived on in his children, growing stronger, each day despite, or perhaps because of, the hardships they'd faced. That night, as she tucked the boys into their beds in the comfortable room above the trading post, Mabel felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, because the grief was still there, still sharp when it caught her unexpectedly, but a sense that they were where they needed to be, doing what they needed to do, becoming who they were meant to become. "Mama," Benjamin said sleepily, "I like it here. May makes good biscuits, and the travelers tell the best stories." "I like it here too," Samuel added. "It feels safe." Safe. It was such a simple word, but it encompassed everything Mabel had been trying to give them: physical security, emotional stability, the knowledge that they were loved and valued exactly as they were. "I'm glad," she said, kissing each. "Boy, good night. Sweet dreams." As she prepared for sleep herself, Mabel reflected on the strange turns their journey had taken. They'd lost everything they'd thought they needed, but somehow found what they actually required: meaningful work, genuine kindness, and the space to heal and grow together as a family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. The frontier was an unforgiving place, and their current security was built on the generosity of one good woman. But tonight, her children were safe and happy, and that was enough. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, carrying the sense of sage and distant snow. Winter was coming, but they would face it together, stronger for the trials they'd already survived. And whatever the future held, Mabel knew now that they had something no amount of money could buy: each other, and the unshakable knowledge that love was worth more than all the advantages wealth could provide. 2 months had passed since they'd arrived at May Hutchins' trading post, and the small tin sewing kit that had travelled with Mabel from her old life had become her most treasured possession. Not for its monetary value. The needles were growing dull, and the thread was nearly exhausted, but for what it represented. Every evening after the boys were asleep and the last customer had been served, she would sit by the fire with May, mending torn shirts and patching worn trousers for the endless stream of travellers who passed through their door. "You've got the finest stitching I've ever seen," May observed one November evening, as she examined a shirt Mabel had just finished repairing. "Practically invisible, but strong as iron. Where'd you learn to sew like that?" Mabel smiled, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she worked on a pair of Samuel's outgrown trousers, carefully letting down the hem to give him another few months of wear. "My mother taught me. She said a woman who could sew well would never want for useful work, no matter what circumstances life brought her." "Wise woman, your mother." She was. Mabel's voice carried the warmth of old memories. "She died when I was 16, but not before she'd taught me everything she knew about running a household. Thomas used to say he married me as much for my practical skills as for my pretty face." May chuckled. "Sound reasoning. A pretty face fades, but good sense lasts a lifetime." Through the thin walls of the trading post, they could hear the wind picking up outside, carrying the promise of the first real snowfall of the season. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls and creating a circle of golden light that made their simple evening feel almost magical. "May," Mabel said carefully, "I've been thinking about what happens when winter truly sets in. The travellers will stop coming through as regularly, and you won't need as much help." "Now stop right there," May interrupted firmly. "I've told you before. You and those boys have a place here as long as you want it. Winter's when I need help most, actually. Keeping the fires going, the cooking, the cleaning, and there's always mending to be done. Seems like every man who comes through here has clothes that are more whole than fabric, but surely you were managing fine before we arrived." "Managing, yes. Living comfortably, no." May set down her own sewing and looked directly at Mabel. "You want the truth? This place was getting to feel like a tomb. Just me and the occasional customer, no conversation worth having, no laughter in the evenings. You and the boys brought life back to this old building." The words warmed Mabel more than the fire ever could. In her darkest moments, she still wondered if she was simply a burden, taking charity from a woman too kind to say so. But May's honest assessment of their mutual benefit helped ease the guilt that sometimes kept her awake at night. "Samuel asked me today if we could stay through the spring," Mabel admitted. "He's worried about Benjamin traveling in the cold weather." Smart boy. Benjamin's still building his strength back after that fever. Better to let him get through the winter someplace warm and settled. As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Samuel appeared in his nightshirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I heard voices," he said apologetically. "I couldn't sleep." "Bad dreams?" Mabel asked, setting aside her sewing to focus on her son. "Not bad dreams exactly," Samuel said, settling on the floor beside her chair. "Just thinking dreams about Papa and the ranch and whether we'll ever have a real home again." The question hit Mabel like a physical blow. In her efforts to make their current situation work, she'd perhaps been too successful in helping the boys adjust. But beneath Samuel's acceptance, the deeper questions remained. Questions about belonging, about the future, about what home even meant anymore. "This feels like home to me," she said carefully. "Here, with you and Benjamin and May." Home isn't just a place, sweetheart. It's the people you love and who love you back. I know that, Samuel said seriously, and I do love May and I love being here, but I keep thinking about the ranch and all the things Papa showed me and wondering if Benjamin will even remember any of it when he grows up. May leaned forward. In her chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Tell me about the ranch, Samuel. What was your favorite thing about it? Samuel's face lit up with memory. Papa had this old gelding named Thunder. Not because he was fast, but because he was so big his hoofbeats sounded like a storm coming. Papa would put me up on Thunder's back and we'd ride out to check the cattle. Papa said someday I'd know. Every inch of that land, every waterhole and canyon and good grazing spot. And you wanted to learn all that? Oh, yes, Samuel said with the passion of a child, discussing his greatest dream. Papa said the land would teach me everything I needed to know if I paid attention. He said every season had its lessons, every animal had something to show me. Mabel felt tears prick her eyes. Thomas had indeed been preparing Samuel to inherit not just property, but a way of life, a relationship with the land that went deeper than ownership. Jeremiah would never understand that connection, would see only the financial value of the ranch and miss its deeper significance entirely. Your papa sounds like he understood something important, May said thoughtfully. That real wealth isn't just what you own, but what you know and how you treat what's been entrusted to you. That's exactly what he said, Samuel exclaimed. He said a good rancher was like a good shepherd, taking care of everything in his keeping from the smallest calf to the biggest bull. Well, May said with a smile, maybe someday you'll have another chance to put those lessons to use. This territory's full of opportunities for a young man who knows how to work with the land instead of just taking from it. Samuel's eyes widened. You think I could really have a ranch someday, even without the money Uncle Jeremiah has? I think, May said carefully, that the most successful men I've known built their fortunes with hard work, good sense, and treating people fairly. Money can give you a head start, but it can't give you character, and character's what lasts. Papa always said character was what you did when nobody was watching, Samuel added. He said if you could be proud of your actions even when you were all alone, then you were becoming a good man. The simple wisdom, spoken in an 8-year-old's voice, filled the room with Thomas's presence as surely as if he'd been sitting beside them. Mabel realized that her greatest fear, that the boys would lose their father's influence, was unfounded. His values, his lessons, his love were woven so deeply into who they were becoming that no amount of separation or hardship could tear them away. Your papa was right, she said softly. And he'd be so proud of the young man you're becoming. Even though we lost the ranch? Even though I couldn't protect you and Benjamin better? The question revealed the weight Samuel had been carrying, the adult responsibility he'd placed on his young shoulders. Mabel knelt down beside him, taking his face in her hands. Samuel, listen to me. What happened to us wasn't your fault, and it wasn't your responsibility to prevent it. You're 8 years old. Your job is to be a little boy, to learn and grow, and help when you can, but not to carry burdens that belong to adults. But Papa said I was the man of the family now. Papa said that to help you feel important and valued, not to make you feel responsible for everything that goes wrong. Mabel interrupted gently. Being the man of the family means being brave and kind and protective of the people you love. It doesn't mean you have to solve every problem or prevent every hardship. Samuel considered this seriously, his young brow furrowed in concentration. So it's okay that I couldn't stop Uncle Jeremiah from making us leave? More than okay. There was nothing you could have done to stop that, and trying would only have made things harder for all of us. May cleared her throat softly. You know, Samuel, I've been thinking about what your papa taught you about the land and animals. We get plenty of travelers through here with livestock, cattle drives, horse traders, families moving west with their animals. Might be you could put some of those lessons to work right here, helping take care of the animals while their owners rest up for the next leg of their journey. Samuel's face brightened considerably. Really? You think I could help with that? Think, May said with a wink, that a boy who knows how to gentle a spooked horse or spot a lame cow would be mighty valuable around here, might even be worth a small wage for a young man who proved himself reliable. The possibility of earning money, of contributing meaningfully to their small family's survival, straightened Samuel's shoulders with pride. But more than that, the chance to use his father's teachings, to honor Thomas's memory through practical application of his lessons, lit a fire in the boy's eyes that Mabel hadn't seen since they'd left the ranch. "I'd work real hard," Samuel promised seriously. "I'd do exactly what you told me and never complain about getting dirty or tired." "I don't doubt it," May replied. "But for now, you'd better get back to bed. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. Heard tell there's a cattle drive coming through, and they'll likely need someone who knows his way around livestock." Samuel hugged both women good night and headed back upstairs, his steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. When he was gone, May and Mabel sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that something important had just happened. "That boy's got his father's heart," May observed finally, "and his mother's good sense. He's going to be just fine." "I hope so," Mabel said, picking up her sewing again. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by them, keeping them out here instead of what? Letting them be raised by people who see them as possessions instead of children. Who'd teach them that money matters more than character?" May's voice carried a rare edge of anger. "You're giving those boys something more valuable than all the advantages money can buy. You're showing them how to survive with dignity, how to find joy in simple things, how to value people for what they are instead of what they have. Sometimes dignity feels like cold comfort when you're mending the same shirt for the third time," Mabel admitted. "And sometimes," May countered, "the things we think we need turn out to be the things that make us weak. You ever notice how the wealthiest travelers are often the most helpless? Can't cook for themselves, can't mend their own clothes, can't solve the simplest problems without throwing money at them." Mabel had noticed exactly that. The wealthy families who occasionally passed through the trading post often seemed utterly dependent on their servants and money to handle even basic challenges, while the poorer travelers showed remarkable resourcefulness and self-reliance. "Your boys are learning skills that will serve them their whole lives," May continued. "They're learning that work has dignity, that problems can be solved with creativity and effort, that happiness doesn't depend on having the finest things. Those are lessons you can't buy in any fancy school." As the evening wound down and they prepared for bed, Mabel reflected on the unexpected turns their journey had taken. She'd lost the security and status of the ranch, but gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that she could provide for her children through her own efforts, that they could find family among strangers, that love and determination could create a home anywhere. The sewing kit caught her eye as she put away their mending, its worn exterior hiding the tools that had become essential to their survival. Like so many things in their new life, it looked humble from the outside, but carried immense value for those who knew how to use it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new travelers with their own stories and needs. Samuel would have his chance. To prove himself with the cattle drive, Benjamin would continue his slow but steady recovery, and she would continue the daily work of building a life from the materials at hand. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was theirs, shaped by their choices and sustained by their efforts. And as she climbed the stairs to the room where her boys slept peacefully, Mabel realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, she was genuinely curious about what the future might hold, rather than simply dreading it. Change was coming. She could feel it in the wind, see it in the way Samuel was growing into his responsibilities, sense it in the gradual healing of their small family's wounds. But whatever that change brought, they would face it together, stronger for the trials. They'd already survived and better prepared for whatever lay ahead. The first real snowfall of winter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, transforming the harsh Wyoming landscape into something soft and magical. Benjamin pressed his nose against the frost-etched window of their room above the trading post, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the fat flakes drift down like feathers from heaven. "Look, Mama," he called excitedly. "It's like God is shaking out his quilts." Mabel smiled at the innocent poetry of his observation, remembering how Thomas used to say similar things about the weather, finding wonder in the everyday miracles that surrounded them. She joined Benjamin at the window, wrapping her arms around his small frame as they watched the world being reborn in white. "It's beautiful," she agreed, "but it also means we'll be staying close to home for a while. You ready for a cozy winter? Can we make snow angels? And maybe build a snowman?" Benjamin's enthusiasm was infectious, his complete recovery from the fever that had nearly claimed him now seeming like a distant nightmare. "We'll see what Samuel thinks when he gets back from helping May with the morning chores," Mabel said. "But I think snow angels sound like a wonderful idea." Samuel had indeed taken to his new responsibilities with the dedication that reminded everyone of his father. Over the past month, he'd proven himself invaluable with the animals that passed through, calming spooked horses, spotting early signs of illness in cattle, and showing a natural ability to understand what each creature needed. May had started paying him a small wage, which he carefully saved in an old tobacco tin, counting and recounting the coins with the serious concentration of a young man planning for the future. The sound of boots stamping on the porch below announced Samuel's return, followed by his voice calling up the stairs. "Mama, come quick! You need to see this!" Mabel hurried downstairs with Benjamin close behind, wondering what could have put such excitement in her older son's voice. She found Samuel standing just inside the main door of the trading post, his cheeks red from cold and his eyes bright with anticipation. "There's a man outside," Samuel announced. "He's got the most beautiful horses I've ever seen, and May says he's staying for a few days because of the storm. But, Mama, I think he might need help." Through the window, Mabel could see a lone figure tending to a string of horses near the small barn May maintained for travelers. Even through the falling snow, she could tell the animals were indeed exceptional, well-bred and carefully maintained, despite the obvious signs of hard travel. But it was the man himself who caught her attention. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone pushing through exhaustion, his shoulders set against more than just the cold wind. When he turned toward the building, she caught a glimpse of a face weathered by sun and hardship, but bearing the kind of quiet strength that reminded her painfully of Thomas. "May's getting a room ready for him," Samuel continued, "but he looks like he hasn't had a proper meal in days, and his horses are tired, Mama, really tired." The concern in Samuel's voice touched something deep in Mabel's chest. Her son had inherited his father's ability to see beneath the surface, to recognize need even when it was hidden behind pride or circumstance. "Well then," she said, smoothing her apron, "I suppose we'd better make sure he feels welcome. Benjamin, why don't you help me prepare some hot soup? Samuel, perhaps you could offer to help him with the horses once he's settled." "Already asked," Samuel said with a grin. "He said he'd be grateful for the help. His name's Will Calder, and he's been traveling for weeks. I think he's looking for somewhere to settle down." Will Calder. The name had a solid, honest sound to it, like something carved from good wood and built to last. Mabel found herself curious about this stranger who'd arrived with the snow, wondering what circumstances had brought him to their door in the depths of winter. 20 minutes later, she got her first real look at him when May brought him into the main room of the trading post. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with the lean build of a man accustomed to physical work. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places but cared for with the attention of someone who understood the value of what he owned. But it was his eyes that struck her most, grey-blue like a winter sky, holding depths of kindness and sorrow that spoke to her own experience of loss. When May introduced them, he removed his hat and nodded respectfully, his manner carrying the gentle courtesy she remembered from her husband. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, his voice carrying the slight rasp. of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. "Mom, I appreciate the hospitality. Your boy Samuel's been telling me about the work you folks do here. Sounds like a fine operation." "Samuel tends to be generous in his assessments," Mabel replied, but she was pleased by the praise nonetheless. "We try to make travelers feel welcome. May tells me you've been on the road for some time." "Longer than I'd planned," Will admitted, settling carefully into the chair May indicated. "Been looking for the right place to settle down, maybe start a small ranch of my own. Heard there might be opportunities in this territory for a man willing to work hard." "There are," May confirmed, setting a steaming bowl of Mabel's vegetable soup in front of him. "Question is whether you've got the patience to build something from nothing, and the sense to recognize good land when you see it." Will's smile transformed, his weathered features revealing the kind of warmth that made people feel instantly at ease. "Well, Mom, I've got more patience than money, and I've been around livestock long enough to know good grazing when I see it. As for the sense part," he chuckled, "I reckon time will tell on that score." "Where are you from originally?" Mabel asked, settling into her own chair with a cup of coffee. Benjamin had climbed into her lap, his curiosity about the stranger temporarily overcoming his usual shyness. "Kansas, originally," Will replied, pausing to taste the soup and nodding appreciatively. "My family had a small farm there. Nothing fancy, but it fed us well enough. Lost it during the grasshopper plague. 5 years back, seemed like those insects ate everything for 3 counties around." Mabel nodded sympathetically. She'd heard stories of the devastation caused by the massive swarms of locusts that had descended on the plains, destroying crops and leaving entire families destitute. "That must have been devastating," she said. "Did you try to rebuild?" "For a while," Will said, his expression growing distant. "But the land was played out, and the bank wasn't interested in extending credit to folks who'd already lost one crop. My parents decided to move in with my sister's family in Missouri, and I figured it was time to try something new." "So, you've been traveling ever since?" Samuel asked, having appeared at Will's elbow with the quiet way he had of joining. "Adult conversations, on and off," Will confirmed. "Worked cattle drives for a couple of years, saved up enough to buy some horses of my own. Been trading and training them while I looked for the right place to put down roots." "Samuel's very good with horses," Mabel said, pride evident in her voice. "His father taught him quite a bit before." She let the sentence trail off, not quite ready to share their story with this kind stranger. But Will seemed to understand, without needing details. "I can tell," he said seriously. "Takes a special touch to gentle animals, the way he was doing out there. Your husband must have been a good teacher." "He was," Samuel said simply. "He said horses were honest. They'd tell you exactly what they thought of you, but they'd never lie or try to trick you." "Smart man," Will agreed. "I've always believed you could judge a person's character by how they treated their animals. Horses especially. They've got long memories for both kindness and cruelty." The afternoon passed pleasantly, with Will proving to be the kind of guest May loved best, grateful for hospitality but not demanding, willing to share stories of his travels without dominating the conversation, and genuinely interested in the people around him. He listened with the focused attention of someone who valued words, laughed easily at Benjamin's innocent observations, and treated Samuel's questions about horse training with the seriousness of a master discussing his craft with a promising apprentice. But it was the way he looked at Mabel that sent unfamiliar flutters through her chest, not with the calculating assessment of men who saw a widow as an opportunity, but with the quiet appreciation of someone who recognized competence and grace when he encountered them. When she served dinner, he noticed the care she'd taken with the preparation. When Benjamin spilled milk on his shirt, Will watched approvingly as she handled the mishap with patience and gentle humor. "You've got fine boys," he told her quietly when the children had gone upstairs to play. "They're a credit to their raising." "Thank you," Mabel replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks at the simple compliment. "They're good children. Their father would be proud of how they've handled recent changes in our circumstances. Changes can be hard on young ones, Will observed, but sometimes they bring out strengths folks didn't know they had. The insight struck Mabel as particularly apt. Samuel had indeed discovered capabilities she'd never seen before, while Benjamin had shown a resilience that amazed her daily. Even she had found reserves of strength and determination she'd never known she possessed. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you have family somewhere?" Will's expression grew more reserved. "Had a wife once," he said quietly. "Lost her to consumption 3 years back. No children. Always regretted that. But maybe it was for the best. Made leaving Kansas easier. When the time came." The simple statement revealed depths of pain that Mabel recognized all too well. She saw in his careful composure the same struggle she faced daily, how to honor the memory of lost love while still embracing the possibility of future happiness. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply. "And I'm sorry for yours," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with understanding that needed no explanation. The moment stretched between them, filled with the unspoken recognition of shared experience. They were both survivors, both rebuilding their lives from the ashes of what they'd lost, both learning to navigate a world that suddenly seemed less predictable and secure than they'd once believed. "Mama!" Benjamin's voice called from upstairs, breaking the spell. "Can Mr. Will come see the picture Samuel drew of Papa's horse?" "If Mr. Calder would like to," Mabel replied, grateful for the interruption and the return to safer conversational ground. Will smiled, the serious moment passing naturally into something lighter. "I'd be honored to see Samuel's artwork," he said. Rising from his chair, "Always been partial to good horse pictures myself." As the evening progressed, Mabel found herself watching Will with growing appreciation. He admired Samuel's drawing with genuine interest, listened to Benjamin's enthusiastic recounting of their journey west, and helped clean up after dinner without being asked. When May mentioned that the barn roof had been leaking, he immediately offered to take a look at it in the morning. "You don't need to do that," May protested. "You're a paying guest, not hired help." "Ma'am," Will said with that transformative smile, "I've never been one to sit idle when there's useful work to be done. Besides, I've got some experience with roofing, might save you the expense of hiring it done." It was exactly the kind of thing Thomas would have said, Mabel realized. The same instinctive generosity, the same assumption that helping others was simply what decent people did. The parallel was both comforting and unsettling, stirring feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to examine. That night, as she helped the boys prepare for bed, Benjamin made an observation that stopped her cold. "I like Mr. Will," he announced as she tucked the covers around him. "He smiles like Papa used to, like he's really happy to see us. He seems like a nice man." Mabel agreed carefully. "Samuel thinks so too," Benjamin continued with the devastating honesty of childhood. "He said Mr. Will knows almost as much about horses as Papa did. Maybe he could teach us more things?" "We'll see, sweetheart," Mabel said, kissing his forehead. "Mr. Will is just passing through. He won't be staying long." But as she said the words, she realized she hoped they weren't entirely true. For the first time since leaving the ranch, their small family had encountered someone who seemed to genuinely appreciate them for who they were, rather than judging them for what they'd lost. Will Calder brought with him a sense of possibility, a reminder that not all strangers meant harm, and that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could change everything. The storm was expected to last several days, which meant Will would be staying at least that long. It wasn't much time, but it was enough for Mabel to begin wondering what it might be like to have a man around again, not as a replacement for Thomas, but as someone who could appreciate the life they were building and perhaps add his own strength to their small foundation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence and possibility. And inside the warm trading post, 4 people who'd all known loss were discovering that sometimes the most important journeys began, not with grand plans, but with simple kindness shared on a cold winter night. The letter arrived on a morning in late February, carried by a circuit rider who'd fought through the last of winter's fury to reach the scattered settlements of the territory. Mabel was kneading bread dough when May called her name from the main room, her voice carrying a note of concern that made Mabel's hands still on the wooden counter. "Mabel, dear," May said carefully, "there's a gentleman here to see you. Says he's a lawyer from Cheyenne with important business regarding your late husband's estate." The blood drained from Mabel's face. In the 4 months since they'd found refuge at the trading post, she'd almost allowed herself to believe that Jeremiah and Constance had forgotten about them, that their small family could continue rebuilding their lives without interference from the past. But now, standing in the doorway with snow still clinging to his expensive coat, was a reminder that some ghosts refuse to stay buried. The man was perhaps 50, with the soft build of someone who spent his days behind a desk rather than in the saddle. His pale eyes swept the modest trading post with the calculating assessment of someone tallying assets, and when his gaze settled on Mabel, she saw something that made her stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, removing his hat to reveal carefully pomaded hair, "I am Cornelius Blackwood, attorney at law. I represent the Rourke family interests, and I'm afraid I have some rather urgent matters to discuss with you." "I can't imagine what business the Rourke family might have with me," Mabel replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "They made their position quite clear when they evicted me and my children from our home." Blackwood's smile held no warmth. But circumstances have changed considerably since then, Mrs. Rourke. Perhaps we might speak privately? The matters at hand are of a delicate nature." May stepped closer to Mabel's side, her weathered face set in lines of protective determination. "Anything you have to say to Mabel can be said in front of me. This is my place, and she's under my protection." "Here, of course," Blackwood said smoothly, though his eyes narrowed slightly at May's interference. "I merely thought Mrs. Rourke might prefer privacy when learning that her children stand to inherit a considerable fortune." The words hit Mabel like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" Blackwood reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "This, Mrs. Rourke, is a copy of a will filed by your late husband just 3 weeks before his death. A will that was discovered only recently among his personal papers. Papers that, it seems, were overlooked during the initial settlement of his estate." With trembling hands, Mabel accepted the envelope, noting how the legal document seemed to weigh far more than mere paper should. "Thomas filed a second will?" "Indeed, and in this document, Mr. Thomas Rourke makes provisions not only for his wife and children, but also reveals certain assets that were previously unknown to the family." Blackwood's pale eyes glittered with an avarice that made Mabel's skin crawl. "It appears your late husband was far more astute in business matters than anyone realized." May moved closer, her protective instincts clearly aroused. "What kind of assets?" "Mineral rights," Blackwood said with the satisfaction of a man delivering a winning hand in poker. "Extensive mineral rights to several thousand acres of territory, including sections that recent geological surveys suggest may contain significant silver deposits." The room seemed to spin around Mabel as the implications hit her. "Silver? Potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, Mrs. Rourke. Perhaps more, depending on the extent of the deposits." Blackwood's voice carried the oily satisfaction of a man who smelled profit. "Your sons, as the primary beneficiaries of their father's estate, stand to become very wealthy young men indeed. But their children," Mabel said weakly, sinking into the nearest chair, "they're only 8 and 6 years old, which is precisely why the family is so concerned." Blackwood continued, "As minors, the boys require a legal guardian to manage their interests. And given the substantial sums involved, the family feels it's essential that their guardianship be handled by individuals with the proper experience and connections to protect their inheritance." The words that had been lurking beneath the lawyer's polite veneer finally emerged with crystal clarity. You mean Jeremiah and Constance want the boys back? The family wishes to ensure that Samuel and Benjamin receive the guidance and education befitting their new station in life, Blackwood said with practiced diplomacy. Surely you can understand that managing such wealth requires expertise that, forgive my bluntness, a woman in your circumstances couldn't possibly possess. My circumstances. Mabel's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. What exactly do you know about my circumstances, Mr. Blackwood? The lawyer's smile turned predatory. I know that you're currently employed as a cleaning woman in a frontier trading post, Mrs. Rourke. I know that your children are receiving no formal education and are being raised in an environment hardly suitable for young gentlemen of means. I know that you've been reduced to accepting charity from strangers and mending clothes for pennies. Each word was calculated to wound, designed to reinforce her sense of inadequacy and dependence. But instead of the shame Blackwood clearly expected, Mabel felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. I know that my children are healthy, happy, and loved, she said, rising from her chair to face him directly. I know they're learning skills that will serve them their entire lives and developing character that no amount of money can buy. I know they're surrounded by people who value them for who they are, not what they might be worth. Admirable sentiments, Blackwood said dismissively, but hardly practical when it comes to managing a fortune of this magnitude. The boys will need legal representation, financial advisors, investment counselors. What the boys need, May interrupted sharply, is their mother and a stable home, not to be treated like property by relatives who showed them the door when they thought they were worthless. Blackwood's mask of politeness slipped slightly. I'm afraid the law is quite clear on this matter. As the boy's uncle and closest male relative, Mr. Jeremiah Rourke has every right to petition for guardianship, and given Mrs. Rourke's obvious inability to provide appropriate guidance— Wait just a minute, a new voice interrupted from the doorway. Will Calder stood there, snow still dusting his shoulders from his morning work with the horses. He'd been staying at the trading post for nearly 3 months now, officially waiting for spring to continue his search for land. But Mabel suspected his reasons for remaining had grown more complex than simple weather delays. Will, Mabel said gratefully, this is Mr. Blackwood. He's a lawyer representing my late husband's family. Will's grey eyes assessed the lawyer with the same careful attention he gave to horses of uncertain temperament. I heard voices raised, he said mildly. Thought I should check that everything was all right. Everything is perfectly fine, Blackwood said with obvious irritation at the interruption. This is a private family matter. Funny thing about that, Will observed, stepping fully into the room and removing his hat. Seems to me that if it was truly a family matter, it would involve people who actually cared about this family's welfare. From what I've heard, the Rourke relatives cared enough to throw a grieving widow and her children out into the wilderness. Hard to see how discovering money changes the nature of their concern. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. I hardly think the opinions of a hired hand are relevant to matters of such legal complexity. Maybe not, Will agreed easily. But I do know something about taking care of what's been entrusted to you. And from where I sit, Mrs. Rourke has done a fine job of protecting and providing for her boys under circumstances that would have broken a lesser woman. The simple validation meant more to Mabel than all of Blackwood's legal documents. Here was someone who had watched her daily struggles, witnessed her efforts to build a life for her children, and found her worthy of respect rather than pity. The point remains, Blackwood said, struggling to regain control of the conversation, that the boys' welfare must be considered. They deserve every advantage their inheritance can provide, the finest schools, the best society, opportunities to mix with others of their station. What they deserve, Mabel said with new conviction, is to be raised by people who love them more than they love their money. Love doesn't generate interest or protect assets from poor investment decisions, Blackwood replied coldly. Sentiment is a luxury these boys can no longer afford. The phrase echoed Jeremiah's earlier dismissal of love as impractical, confirming Mabel's suspicion that this was less about the boys' welfare than about control of their newfound wealth. She looked at the legal document in her hands, seeing it not as salvation, but as a trap that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. "I'm afraid time is somewhat limited," Blackwood replied with false regret. "The family is quite anxious to resolve the guardianship issue, and there are pressing business decisions that cannot be delayed indefinitely. I've been instructed to return to Cheyenne with your answer, and the boys, within the week." "The boys aren't going anywhere," May said with the flat finality of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. Blackwood's smile turned ugly. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, madam. The law is quite clear about the rights of blood relatives in matters of guardianship. If Mrs. Rourke refuses to cooperate voluntarily, other measures can be taken." "What kind of measures?" Will asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Blackwood take an involuntary step backward. "Legal measures," the lawyer said quickly. "Court orders, custody proceedings, all perfectly lawful, I assure you, and all designed to separate children from the only stable home they've known since their father's death," Will observed. "Funny how the law seems to favor money over love. The law favors what's best for the children," Blackwood insisted, "and what's best for them is proper guidance in managing their inheritance and preparation for their rightful place in society." "Their rightful place," Mabel said quietly, "is with their mother." "Their rightful place," Blackwood corrected, "is wherever they can be properly prepared for the responsibilities that come with significant wealth. And I'm afraid that is not in a frontier trading post with a woman who has demonstrated her inability to provide for them adequately." The cruel dismissal of everything she'd accomplished, everything she'd sacrificed to keep her family together, hit Mabel like a slap. But before she could respond, the sound of running footsteps announced Samuel's arrival from the barn. "Mama!" he called excitedly as he burst through the door. "The new foal is finally standing on his own, and Will says—" He stopped abruptly, sensing the tension in the room. His bright eyes moved from his mother's pale face to the stranger's hostile expression, and his expression grew wary. "Samuel," Mabel said gently, "this is Mr. Blackwood. He's brought news about your father's estate." Samuel moved instinctively to his mother's side, his 8-year-old frame radiating protective energy that would have made his father proud. "What kind of news?" Blackwood's expression softened artificially as he focused on the boy. "Very good news, Samuel. It appears your father left you and your brother a substantial inheritance, enough to ensure you'll never want for anything again." "We don't want for anything now," Samuel replied with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "We have Mama and May and Will, and that's all we need." The simple statement seemed to deflate Blackwood's carefully constructed arguments about the boys' welfare. Here was living proof that love and security couldn't be measured in dollars, that happiness didn't require wealth or social position. "Nevertheless," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a note of desperation, "there are legal obligations that must be met. Your Uncle Jeremiah is very concerned about your future." "Uncle Jeremiah threw us out," Samuel interrupted, his young voice carrying hard-earned wisdom. "He said we weren't good enough for the family. Why would he want us back now?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun, revealing the fundamental hypocrisy of the Rourke family's sudden concern. Blackwood's carefully rehearsed arguments crumbled in the face of an 8-year-old's logic. "Circumstances have changed," the lawyer said weakly. "No," Samuel replied with devastating clarity. "Money changed. We're still the same people Uncle Jeremiah didn't want around his precious ranch." As Mabel looked at her son, standing tall and proud despite his youth, seeing through adult deceptions with remarkable clarity, she realized that Thomas's greatest gift to his children hadn't been the mineral rights or the potential fortune. It had been the values and strength of character that no legal document could grant or take away. "Mr. Blackwood," she said with new resolve, "I think you should leave now. I need time to discuss this with my children and consider our options." Mrs. "Rourke, I strongly advise you not to be hasty, and I strongly advise you," Will said, stepping forward with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with conflict, "to respect the lady's wishes." Blackwood looked around the room, taking in the united front of people who had clearly chosen to stand with Mabel and her children rather than bow to legal pressure and family wealth. His calculating expression suggested he was reassessing his strategy. "Very well," he said finally, gathering his papers with obvious reluctance. "But I trust you understand the gravity of the situation, Mrs. Rourke. Your children's future, their entire lives, hang in the balance. I hope you'll make the right decision." As the lawyer departed, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and the weight of impossible choices, Mabel sank back into her chair and stared at the legal document that had changed everything. In her hands lay the power to give her boys advantages she'd never dreamed possible, or the key to losing them forever to people who valued their wealth more than their souls. The inheritance that should have been a blessing had become a curse, threatening to destroy the fragile happiness they'd built from the ashes of their old life. And somewhere in Cheyenne, Jeremiah and Constance Rourke were undoubtedly planning their next move in a game where her children's love and loyalty were the stakes. 3 days after Blackwood's departure, Will Calder stood in the doorway of May's small storage room, carefully cleaning the Winchester rifle that had belonged to his father. The weapon was old but well-maintained, its stock worn smooth by decades of capable hands, and as Will worked the action to ensure it functioned properly, he tried not to think about why he might need it. "You really think they'll come with force?" May asked from behind him, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who'd seen enough frontier justice to know that money and legal papers didn't always respect moral boundaries. "Blackwood struck me as the type who doesn't like to hear no," Will replied, setting the rifle aside and checking his ammunition supply. "And if what Mabel told us about her brother-in-law is true, Jeremiah Rourke is used to getting his way through intimidation." "They've got the law on their side," May observed grimly. "Blood relation, financial resources, legal precedent, all the things that matter to judges and magistrates." Will's jaw tightened. "They've got money and connections. That's not the same as having right on their side." Through the thin walls, they could hear Mabel's voice reading to the boys from one of May's precious books, her gentle tones creating a circle of normalcy in the midst of their growing crisis. For 3 days, she'd maintained the routines that gave her children security, but Will had seen the strain in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. "She's holding up better than I expected," May said, following his gaze toward the main room. "She's stronger than she knows," Will agreed, "but she shouldn't have to face this alone." The truth was, Will Calder had fallen in love with Mabel Rourke, somewhere between watching her nurse her sick child back to health and seeing her teach Samuel to value honest work over easy money. Her grace under pressure, her fierce protection of her children, her ability to find joy in simple pleasures despite the hardships she'd endured, all of it had captured his heart more completely than he'd thought possible. "You planning to stick around for whatever comes next?" May asked with the direct manner that characterized all her conversations. "If she'll have me," Will said simply. "Those boys need a man willing to stand between them and people who'd use them for their own gain. And what about their mother? What does she need?" Will was quiet for a long moment, considering the complexities of their situation. "She needs to know she's not alone, that someone believes in her judgment and trusts her to do right by her children." "You told her that?" "Not in so many words." Will ran his hand through his hair, frustrated by his own hesitation. "Hard to declare yourself to a woman who's facing the fight of her life. Seems selfish to burden her with my feelings when she's got so much else to worry about." May's laugh held no humor. "Son, that woman's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for months. Might be she'd welcome someone willing to help shoulder the load." Before Will could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the winter air. Multiple riders, moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. May and Will exchanged a quick glance before moving to the front window, where they could see a party of 6 men cresting the hill that overlooked the trading post. "Blackwood's back," May observed grimly, "and he brought friends." Will recognized the lawyer immediately, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the rough clothing of his companions. But it was the man riding beside Blackwood that made Will's blood run cold. Tall and imperious even in the saddle, with the kind of bearing that spoke of a lifetime of having his will obeyed without question. "That'll be Jeremiah Rourke," Will said, noting the family resemblance to the photograph Mabel had shown him of her late husband. But where Thomas had possessed warmth and kindness, his brother radiated cold authority and barely contained arrogance. "Mabel," May called quietly, "you better come see this." Mabel appeared with Benjamin in her arms and Samuel close beside her, her face pale but composed as she took in the sight of the approaching riders. "So soon," she whispered. "I thought we'd have more time." "Time for what?" Samuel asked, his young voice sharp with worry. "Mama, who are those men?" "Your Uncle Jeremiah," Mabel replied, setting Benjamin down and placing protective hands on both boys' shoulders. "He's come to discuss your inheritance." "I don't want to discuss anything with him," Samuel said with the fierce loyalty of a child who remembered being cast out. "He was mean to you, Mama. He made us leave our home." "I know, sweetheart," Mabel said softly, "but sometimes we have to face difficult people to protect what matters most." Will moved to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "You don't have to face him alone." The simple promise seemed to strengthen her resolve. "Thank you," she said quietly, then turned to May. "Would you mind taking the boys upstairs? I think this conversation is better handled by adults." "But Mama," Samuel began to protest. "No arguments," Mabel said firmly. "This is grown-up business, and I need to know you and Benjamin are safe." May shepherded the reluctant boys toward the stairs, but not before Samuel broke free for one last fierce hug with his mother. "Don't let them take us away," he whispered against her shoulder. "Please, Mama, we want to stay with you." "I'll do everything in my power to keep us together," Mabel promised, though her voice caught slightly on the words. As the boys disappeared upstairs, the sound of boots on the porch announced the arrival of their visitors. Jeremiah Rourke entered, without waiting for an invitation, his pale eyes sweeping the modest trading post with the same dismissive assessment Mabel remembered from their last encounter. Behind him came Blackwood and 4 men whose hard faces and gun belts suggested they weren't lawyers or clerks. "Mabel," Jeremiah said without preamble, "I trust you've had time to consider Mr. Blackwood's proposal." "I've had time to consider. What's best for my children," Mabel replied, her voice steady despite the intimidating presence of armed men in May's peaceful establishment. "Excellent," Jeremiah said with false warmth. "Then you understand that the boys need proper guidance to manage their inheritance. We've made arrangements with the finest preparatory school in Boston. They'll receive the education and refinement necessary for their new station in life." "Their new station," Will observed mildly, "or your new access to their money." Jeremiah's gaze shifted to Will with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating potential threat. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Will Calder," Will replied, not offering his hand. "Friend of the family." "Ah, the hired hand," Jeremiah said dismissively. "I'm afraid this conversation doesn't concern you. Anything that concerns Mabel and her boys concerns me," Will said with quiet intensity, "especially when it involves men with guns trying to separate children from their mother." "Those men are here for our protection," Blackwood interjected quickly. "The frontier can be dangerous, and we're carrying important legal documents." "Funny," May said from the bottom of the stairs, having returned from settling the boys. "How?" "Danger seems to follow certain types of legal documents." Jeremiah's patience visibly frayed. Enough of this. Mabel, the law is clear. As the boy's uncle and closest male relative, I have every right to petition for guardianship. The only question is whether this transition happens cooperatively or through more formal channels. More formal channels like armed men? Will asked, his hand drifting casually toward his gun belt. Like court orders and federal marshals, Jeremiah replied coldly, though I'd prefer to handle this as a family matter. Family matters, Mabel said with growing anger, are generally handled by people who actually care about the family. You threw us out, Jeremiah. You called my children illegitimate burdens on the Rourke name. The only thing that's changed is their bank account. What's changed, Jeremiah snapped, his composure finally cracking, is that I now have a responsibility to ensure those boys aren't raised like common frontier brats. They're heirs to a fortune, Mabel. They need to understand their obligations and responsibilities. They understand their obligations, Samuel's voice called from the top of the stairs, where he and Benjamin had apparently been listening despite May's efforts to keep them away. Papa taught us that our obligation is to take care of people. We love and be honest in all our dealings. Samuel, go back to your room, Mabel said sharply, but her son continued down the stairs with the determined stride of a boy who'd made an important decision. No, Mama, Samuel said, moving to stand beside her. I want to tell Uncle Jeremiah something. Jeremiah looked down at his nephew with the expression of a man unused to being contradicted by children. What is it, boy? I remember what you said. When Papa died, Samuel said with devastating clarity, you said we weren't really Rourkes because Mama wasn't good enough for your family. You said we'd never amount to anything because we had bad blood from Mama's side. The adult implications of Samuel's words, the casual cruelty, the calculated insults designed to wound a grieving family, hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Even Blackwood looked uncomfortable at this revelation of his client's character. You also said, Samuel continued relentlessly, that you never wanted to see us again because we reminded you of Papa's poor judgment. So why do you want us now, Uncle Jeremiah? Did our blood get better when we got money? The 8-year-old's logic was so devastating, so perfectly reasoned, that even Jeremiah seemed momentarily at a loss for words. But his recovery was swift, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the chill of winter wind. Children often misunderstand adult conversations, he said dismissively. What matters now is securing your future and ensuring you receive the guidance necessary to manage your inheritance properly. What matters, Benjamin said, appearing at his brother's side with the fearless loyalty of a 6-year-old defending his family, is staying with Mama and Will and May. They love us. You just want our money. That's enough, Jeremiah snapped, his carefully maintained facade finally crumbling completely. I didn't come here to be lectured by children or to justify myself to people who clearly don't understand the realities of the situation. He turned to his hired men, his intentions clear in the set of his shoulders. Bring the boys, we're leaving. No, Mabel said firmly, stepping between the men and her children. They're not going anywhere. I'm afraid they are, Blackwood said, producing a legal document. This is a temporary custody order, signed by Judge Morrison in Cheyenne. It grants Mr. Jeremiah Rourke immediate guardianship pending a full hearing. Will stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the armed men. That paper doesn't mean much if you can't enforce it. Oh, we can enforce it, one of the gunmen said with obvious relish. Question is whether you want to make this hard on the lady and her boys. The threat hung in the air like the promise of violence, and Mabel felt her world narrowing to this moment, this choice between submission and resistance. She looked at her children, Samuel standing tall and protective despite his youth, Benjamin clinging to his brother's hand but showing no signs of backing down, and realized that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought not for victory but for principle. You're making a mistake, Jeremiah, she said quietly. Those boys love me, and I love them. No amount of money or legal maneuvering can change that. Love, Jeremiah replied with contempt, is a luxury they can no longer afford. They have responsibilities, now obligations that go far beyond your limited understanding. Their only obligation, Will said, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled anger, is to grow up to be good men. And they won't learn that from people who use money and force to get their way. Their obligation, Jeremiah corrected, coldly, is to honor their father's legacy by taking their rightful place in society, something that will never happen if they're raised by a woman who works for wages and a drifter with delusions of importance. The insults were calculated to wound and intimidate, but instead of backing down, Mabel felt something crystallize inside her, a core of steel she hadn't known she possessed. "You're right about one thing, Jeremiah," she said with new conviction. "They do have an obligation to honor their father's legacy. Thomas valued character over money, love over status, doing right over doing well. If you take those boys away from everything that represents his values, you'll destroy the very legacy you claim to be protecting." "Sentiment," Jeremiah dismissed. "Thomas's sentiment nearly bankrupted the ranch and left him dead at 35. I won't watch his sons follow the same path." "Thomas's love," Samuel said, with the wisdom of a child who truly understood his father's teachings, made people want to be better than they were. "Your money just makes people afraid of you." The contrast was so stark, the truth so undeniable, that even Jeremiah's hired men seemed uncomfortable with their role in the proceedings, but their employer's determination remained unshaken. "Enough." "Philosophy," Jeremiah said with finality. "Boys, get your things. We're leaving for Cheyenne tonight." "We're not going," Samuel said with quiet determination. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice in the matter," Blackwood said, gesturing to the armed men. That's when Will Calder made his stand, stepping forward with the fluid grace of a man who'd faced danger before and wasn't intimidated by hired guns or legal documents. "Actually," he said with deadly calm, "they do have a choice, and so do you. You can leave now, peacefully, and we can settle this through proper legal channels, or you can try to take those boys by force and discover that some things are worth fighting for." The standoff crystallized in that moment. 6 armed men facing a farmer with a rifle, a determined widow, and an elderly woman who'd survived decades on the frontier. On paper, it seemed like no contest. But as Mabel looked around the room at the people who'd chosen to stand with her, she realized that sometimes the most important victories weren't won through superior force, but through the simple refusal to surrender what mattered most. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and reminding everyone present that spring was still weeks away. Inside the warm trading post, 2 families, one bound by blood and money, the other by choice and love, prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just the boys' immediate future, but the kind of men they would become. The stakes had never been higher, and the cost of losing had never been more devastating. But as Samuel and Benjamin moved closer to their mother's side, their young faces set with determination that would have made their father proud, Mabel knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. That, at least, was something no legal document could take away. The gold pocket watch in Jeremiah Rourke's vest caught the lamplight as he checked the time, with the deliberate gesture of a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. The expensive timepiece had belonged to his father, and, before him, to his grandfather, a symbol of the Rourke family's accumulated wealth and influence spanning 3 generations. Now, as he faced down a widow, a drifter, and an elderly woman in a frontier trading post, it seemed to mock the very values it represented. 10 minutes, Jeremiah announced, snapping the watch closed with authority. "That's how long I'm willing to waste on this theatrical display of defiance. After that, we take the boys with or without your cooperation." Mabel felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice remained steady as she replied, "Then you'll be taking them over my dead body? That can be arranged." one of Jeremiah's hired men muttered, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Will stepped forward, his own weapon visible, but not yet drawn. "Careful, friend. Threatening a woman and children isn't the kind of work most decent men sign up for. Most decent men don't get paid what we're getting paid," the gunman replied with an ugly grin. The casual admission that violence was simply another business transaction seemed to crystallize something in the room. This wasn't about law or family or even money. It was about power and the willingness of some people to use force to take what they wanted from those too weak to resist. "Is this really what you want your nephews to remember about you?" "May," asked Jeremiah, her weathered face showing decades of frontier wisdom. "The day their uncle brought hired guns to tear them away from their mother? What I want," Jeremiah replied coldly, "is for them to understand that sentiment and wishful thinking don't govern the real world. They have responsibilities now, obligations, that go far beyond their emotional attachments." "Uncle Jeremiah," Samuel said, stepping forward with the careful dignity of a boy trying to be a man, "I remember Papa telling me about when you were children together. He said you used to protect him from bullies at school, that you once fought 3 older boys because they made fun of his stutter." The unexpected memories seemed to catch Jeremiah off guard, a flicker of something almost human crossing his heart. Features before being quickly suppressed. "What happened to that person?" Samuel continued with devastating innocence. "The one who protected people instead of hurting them?" "I grew up," Jeremiah snapped, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I learned that protecting people sometimes means making hard choices they don't understand. Papa said protecting people meant standing between them and anyone who wanted to hurt them," Benjamin added, his 6-year-old logic cutting through adult justifications like a blade. "Not bringing the people who want to hurt them." Blackwood cleared his throat nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mr. Rourke, perhaps we should simply proceed with the legal process. The longer we delay, the more complicated this becomes." But before Jeremiah could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the winter air. Multiple riders moving fast, and from the way Will's expression sharpened, these weren't part of Jeremiah's party. "Expecting more company?" Will asked mildly, though his hand had moved closer to his weapon. Through the window, they could see a group of riders cresting the hill, but these men bore the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement rather than hired guns. Leading them was a tall man with a silver star pinned to his heavy coat, his weathered face carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with frontier disputes. "Sheriff Thompson," May said with obvious relief. "Thank God." Jeremiah's face darkened with anger. "You sent for the law?" "I sent word that there might be trouble," May replied without apology. "Sheriff Thompson's been keeping an eye on things since word got out about the boy's inheritance. Seems he doesn't approve of armed men threatening families in his territory." The sheriff dismounted and approached the trading post with the measured stride of a man who'd dealt with similar situations before. Behind him came 3 deputies, all carrying themselves with the professional competence that marked experienced. "Lawman, afternoon, folks," Sheriff Thompson said as he entered, his keen eyes immediately assessing the tension in the room. "Heard there might be some disagreement here about the welfare of the Rourke boys." "There's no disagreement," Jeremiah said with forced calm. "I'm here to collect my nephews under a valid court order. This is a family matter. Family matters that require hired guns tend to stop being family matters," the sheriff observed, his gaze taking in Jeremiah's armed companions, "especially when they involve children." Blackwood stepped forward, producing his legal documents with the flourish of a man playing his strongest card. "Sheriff, this is a lawful custody order signed by Judge Morrison. We're well within our legal rights." Sheriff Thompson accepted the papers and read them carefully, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. The silence stretched taut as everyone waited for his verdict, knowing that his words could determine the boy's fate. "Orders valid," he said finally, and Mabel felt her heart sink. "But there's a problem with the circumstances under which it was obtained." "What kind of problem?" Blackwood asked, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. The kind where a judge signs papers based on false information, the sheriff replied grimly. See, I took the liberty of riding to Cheyenne myself after May sent word about this situation, had an interesting conversation with Judge Morrison about the representations made to him regarding Mrs. Rourke's circumstances. Jeremiah's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. I'm sure there's some misunderstanding. Oh, there was a misunderstanding, all right, the sheriff continued. Judge Morrison was told that Mrs. Rourke had abandoned her children and was living as a woman of questionable virtue in a frontier saloon. Funny thing is, that's not quite how things look from where I'm standing. The deliberate misrepresentation of facts hit Mabel like a physical blow. To think that Jeremiah had painted her as an unfit mother, a woman who'd abandoned her children for a life of vice, filled her with a rage that burned hotter than her fear. You lied to the judge, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. You told him I was a prostitute who deserted my children. I told him you were living in circumstances unsuitable for raising children of good family, Jeremiah replied. But his words carried less conviction now that the truth was emerging. Which circumstances would those be? The sheriff asked with dangerous quiet. Working honest jobs to support her children, keeping them fed, clothed, and educated, teaching them the value of hard work and decent behavior? Sheriff, Blackwood interjected desperately, regardless of the specific representations made to the court, the fundamental issue remains. These boys require proper guidance to manage their inheritance. Seems to me they've been getting proper guidance, Sheriff Thompson replied, from their mother, who's managed to keep them safe and healthy despite being thrown out of their home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The sheriff's words carried the weight of moral authority, and even Jeremiah's hired men seemed to shrink under his disapproving gaze. These were men accustomed to intimidating the weak and defenseless, not to facing down lawmen who understood the difference between legal technicalities and simple justice. Furthermore, the sheriff continued, Judge Morrison was quite disturbed to learn that he'd been deceived about the true circumstances. He's prepared to void this custody order pending a full investigation into the matter. You can't void a legal document based on hearsay, Blackwood protested, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. I can when it was obtained through fraud, the sheriff replied firmly, and I can certainly prevent its enforcement when it would result in harm to innocent children. Samuel and Benjamin had moved closer to their mother during this exchange, their young faces showing a mixture of hope and confusion as they tried to follow the adult conversation that would determine their future. Does this mean we can stay with Mama? Benjamin asked in a small voice. It means, the sheriff said gently, that no one's taking you anywhere against your will, or your mother's will. Not today, anyway. The relief that flooded through Mabel was so intense she felt her knees weaken. Will's strong hand on her elbow steadied her as she struggled to process the sudden reversal of fortune. But Jeremiah wasn't finished. His face twisted with a rage that transformed his features into something ugly and desperate. You fools don't understand what you're interfering with, he snarled, his careful composure finally cracking completely. Those boys are sitting on a fortune that could transform this entire territory. They need guidance from people who understand money and power, not sentimental nonsense about love and family. What they need, Will said with quiet intensity, is to grow up knowing the difference between right and wrong. Something they'll never learn from people who lie to judges and threaten women and children. And what would you know about it? Jeremiah demanded, turning his fury on Will. You're nothing but a drifter with delusions of importance. What could you possibly offer those boys that I can't provide? Will was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes steady as he considered his response. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. I can offer them an example of what it means to work for what you have instead of inheriting it. I can show them how to treat people with respect regardless of their station in life. I can teach them that a man's worth is measured by his character, not his bank account. Character doesn't pay bills or build empires, Jeremiah snapped. No, Will agreed. But it builds something more important. It builds men you can trust, depend on, and be proud to call family. That's worth more than all the money in your banks. The contrast between the two men's values was so stark, so fundamental, that it seemed to illuminate everything wrong with Jeremiah's approach. Here was a man who'd worked for everything he had, who understood the value of honest labor and simple decency, standing against a man who saw people as assets to be managed and money as the measure of all worth. "This isn't over," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the promise of future conflict. "I have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach farther than this backwater territory. I will not allow my brother's sons to be raised like common laborers." "Your brother's sons," Mabel said with new strength, "will be raised to honor their father's memory." And Thomas valued kindness over cruelty, love over money, and doing right over doing well. "If you try to change that, you'll destroy everything." He tried to give them. Jeremiah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Thomas died poor and forgotten, leaving his family dependent on charity. Is that really the legacy you want for his sons?" "Thomas died loved and respected by everyone who knew him," Mabel replied. "He left his sons the knowledge that they were valued for who they were, not what they owned. That's a legacy worth preserving." The fundamental difference in their understanding of what constituted true wealth and success hung in the air like smoke from a gun. No amount of argument would bridge the gap between their worldviews. No compromise could reconcile their competing visions for the boys' future. Sheriff Thompson stepped forward, his presence a reminder that law and order still held sway, even in disputes between family members. "Mr. Rourke," he said formally, "I'm going to have to ask you and your men to leave now. This matter will be resolved through proper legal channels, not through intimidation or force." "This isn't finished," Jeremiah said, his pale eyes promising future trouble. "Those boys belong with their family, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure they receive proper guidance." "Their family," Samuel said with the devastating clarity of childhood, "is right here. These are the people who love us and take care of us. You're just the person who threw us away until we got valuable." The 8-year-old's words hit their target with the precision of an arrow, revealing the ugly truth beneath all of Jeremiah's legal maneuvering and moral justifications. His sudden interest in the boys' welfare had nothing to do with their well-being, and everything to do with their bank accounts. As Jeremiah and his hired men filed out of the trading post, their expensive clothes and weapons a stark contrast to the simple honesty of the people they'd tried to intimidate, Mabel felt something shift inside her chest. The immediate crisis had passed, but the war for her children's future was far from over. The gold pocket watch caught the light one last time as Jeremiah paused in the doorway, his cold eyes promising that this defeat was temporary. Money and influence were powerful weapons, and he had plenty of both. But as Mabel looked around the room at the people who'd stood with her, May with her frontier wisdom, Will with his quiet strength, Sheriff Thompson with his commitment to justice, she realized that some things were more powerful than money. Love, loyalty, and the simple refusal to surrender what mattered most had won the day. The question now was whether it would be enough to win the war. The silence that followed Jeremiah's departure felt fragile, like the calm after a storm that everyone knew was only temporary. Sheriff Thompson remained at the window, watching the retreating figures until they disappeared over the hill, his weathered face thoughtful and concerned. "They'll be back," he said finally, turning to face the small group that had weathered the confrontation. "Men like Jeremiah Rourke don't give up easy, especially when there's this much money at stake." "How long do we have?" Will asked, his hand still resting protectively on his rifle. "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how fast he can work his connections in Cheyenne." The sheriff's expression was grim. "He's got the resources to drag this through the courts for years if he wants to." Mabel felt the weight of the ongoing threat settle over her like a heavy blanket. The immediate danger had passed, but the war for her children's future stretched ahead with no clear end in sight. "Mama," Samuel said quietly, moving to her side with the solemn bearing that had become familiar since their troubles began. What did Uncle Jeremiah mean about making this take years? Before Mabel could answer, Benjamin tugged at her skirt, his young face troubled. "Are they going to keep trying to take us away forever?" The questions pierced Mabel's heart. Her children shouldn't have to worry about such things, shouldn't have to live with the constant fear of being torn away from everything they held dear. But the reality of their situation demanded honesty, even when the truth was painful. "I don't." "No, sweetheart," she admitted, kneeling down to their level. "But I promise you this, no matter what happens, no matter how long it takes, I will never stop fighting for our family." Samuel's response surprised everyone in the room. Instead of the fear or sadness they might have expected, his young face lit up with a determination that was pure Thomas Rourke. "Then we'll fight too," he declared with the fierce conviction of an 8-year-old who'd made an important decision. "Won't we, Benjamin?" His younger brother nodded solemnly. "We choose our family," Benjamin said, the words carrying a weight far beyond his 6 years. "We choose Mama and Will and May, not Uncle Jeremiah." The simple declaration hit the room like a thunderclap. Here were 2 children, facing the prospect of a life of luxury and privilege, choosing instead the people who loved them over the relatives. Who would use them? Their moral clarity was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Boys," Sheriff Thompson said gently, "you understand what you're saying? Your uncle could give you fine schools, fancy clothes, all the advantages money can buy." "Papa always said the best things in life couldn't be bought," Samuel replied, with the wisdom of a child who'd truly listened to his father's teachings. "He said love, friendship, and doing right were worth more than all the gold in the world. And Mama gives us all those things," Benjamin added. "Uncle Jeremiah just wants to buy us like we're horses at market." The sheriff exchanged a meaningful look with May, both of them recognizing the remarkable character these children displayed despite their youth. In a world where money often corrupted even good people, Samuel and Benjamin Rourke had chosen love over luxury, with the certainty of those who understood what truly mattered. "There's something else you should know," Sheriff Thompson said, his voice carrying a note of reluctance. "Jeremiah's not just planning to drag this through the courts. Word is, he's been talking to some territorial politicians about your situation. Seems he's suggesting that a woman raising heirs to such a fortune without proper male guidance might be a threat to territorial stability." "What's that supposed to mean?" Will asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "It means he's trying to make this about more than just family law," the sheriff explained grimly. "He's positioning it as a matter of territorial interests, suggesting that boys with that much money need to be under the control of people with established business connections and political influence." May snorted with disgust. "In other words, he's trying to buy his way to guardianship through political connections." "That's about the size of it," the sheriff confirmed. "And unfortunately, that kind of approach has been known to work when there's enough money involved." The revelation hit Mabel like a physical blow. It was one thing to fight Jeremiah in court, quite another to battle an entire political machine motivated by greed and the promise of access to her children's fortune. "Then we're fighting more than just one man," she said quietly. "We're fighting a system that values money over children's welfare." "Not the whole system," Sheriff Thompson said firmly. "There are still people in positions of authority who believe in doing right over doing well. Judge Morrison was genuinely disturbed when he learned how he'd been deceived. There are others who feel the same way." "But will that be enough?" Will asked bluntly. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much truth to share. "Honestly, I don't know. Jeremiah Rourke has more money and influence than most people in this territory see in a lifetime. He can afford the best lawyers, can make generous contributions to the right political campaigns, can promise business opportunities to people in positions to help him. And what do we have to fight that with? Mabel asked, though she dreaded the answer. The truth, Samuel said before anyone else could respond, and each other. The 8-year-old's words hung in the air with unexpected power. Here was a child who'd lost his father, his home, and his inheritance, at least temporarily, yet still believed that truth and family were weapons enough to fight the forces arrayed against them. "You know what?" May said, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "The boy's right. We've got something Jeremiah Rourke can't buy and can't understand. We've got people who genuinely care about what happens to these children. That's all." "Well and good," Will said grimly, "but it won't stop hired guns or corrupt judges." "Maybe not," Sheriff Thompson agreed. "But it might stop something more important. It might stop people from forgetting what this is really about." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching horses reached them again through the evening air. But this time, instead of the measured pace of men on business, they heard the casual rhythm of neighbors arriving for a visit. Through the window, Mabel could see Tom Mitchell, the kind stranger who'd helped them find the trading post all those months ago, dismounting near the porch. Behind him came other faces she recognized from the community that had grown around May's establishment. Travelers who'd become friends, local ranchers who'd found honest dealing and fair prices, families who'd discovered that the trading post was more than just a business. It was a gathering place for decent people trying to build something good in a hard land. "Heard there might be trouble," Tom said as he entered, his easy manner belying the serious purpose of his visit. "Thought maybe you could use some company." "Word travels fast," May observed, but her tone carried gratitude rather than complaint. "Good news and bad news both have wings out here," Tom replied. "Folks heard about men with guns coming to threaten a widow and her children. Didn't sit well with most people." As the evening progressed, more neighbors arrived. The trading post, filled with people who'd come simply to show their support, to bear witness that the community valued justice over money, character over connections. There was the widow Peterson, whose husband had died in a mining accident and who understood what it meant to face the world alone with children to protect. There was young Jake Sullivan, barely out of his teens but already building a reputation as an honest horse trader. There was the Reverend Matthews, whose circuit included the trading post and who'd watched Samuel and Benjamin grow in wisdom and character under their mother's guidance. "Mrs. Rourke," Reverend Matthews said quietly, drawing Mabel aside, "I want you to know that whatever legal battles lie ahead, you're not facing them alone. This community has seen how you've raised those boys, seen the kind of people they're becoming under your guidance. That means something." "I appreciate the support, Reverend," Mabel replied, "but I'm not sure how much that will matter against Jeremiah's money and influence." "You might be surprised," the Reverend said with a gentle smile. "Truth has a way of rising to the surface, especially when good people are willing to speak it." As the impromptu gathering continued, Samuel and Benjamin moved among the adults. With the easy confidence of children who knew they were valued and protected, they answered questions about their schooling Mabel had been teaching them from May's books, demonstrated their knowledge of horses and cattle learned from both, their father and Will, and showed the kind of courtesy and consideration that spoke well of their upbringing. "Those boys are a credit to their raising," Tom Mitchell observed to Will, as they watched Samuel carefully explaining something to one of the younger visitors. "Hard to see how anyone could argue they need different guidance." "The argument isn't about what's best for the boys," Will replied grimly. "It's about who gets to control their money." "Then maybe it's time people understood that," Tom said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time the whole territory knew what this is really about." The suggestion sparked something in Will's mind, a strategy that might turn Jeremiah's greatest advantage against him. "What if we made this public?" he said slowly, the idea taking shape as he spoke. "What if we let everyone know exactly what Jeremiah Rourke is trying to do and why?" "How do you mean?" May asked, having overheard the conversation. "I mean we tell the whole story," Will explained, his excitement growing. "We let people know that Jeremiah threw out a grieving widow and her children when he thought they were worthless, then tried to steal them back when he discovered they were rich. We let people judge for themselves what kind of man does something like that." Sheriff Thompson nodded approvingly. "Public opinion can be a powerful force, especially in a territory where most people still believe in fairness and decency. But how do we reach enough people to matter?" Mabel asked. "Leave that to us," Tom Mitchell said with a grin. "You'd be amazed how fast word can travel when it's carried by people who believe in what they're saying." As the evening wound down and the neighbors gradually departed, each promising to spread the word about the true nature of the conflict, Mabel felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. The strength that came from being part of a community that valued the same things she did. "Mama," Samuel said as she tucked him into bed that night, "are we going to win?" The question hung in the air with all the weight of a child's need for reassurance in an uncertain world. Mabel looked into her son's serious brown eyes and saw Thomas looking back at her. The same quiet courage, the same determination to do right regardless of the cost. "I don't know if we'll win, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I know we'll never stop trying, and I know that no matter what happens, we'll face it together." "Good," Samuel said with satisfaction, "because I choose you, Mama. I choose our family. And I don't think Uncle Jeremiah understands that some things can't be bought." As she kissed her sons goodnight and prepared for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Mabel reflected on the truth of Samuel's words. Jeremiah had money, influence, and political connections, but they had something more powerful. They had chosen each other, not out of obligation or expectation, but out of love. And sometimes, in a world that often forgot the difference between price and value, that was enough to move mountains. The battle for her children's future was far from over, but tonight, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stand with them simply because it was the right thing to do, Mabel allowed herself to believe that love might indeed prove stronger than money, and that truth might yet prevail over power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new attempts to separate her from her children. But tonight, her family was together, protected not just by law, but by a community that understood what really mattered. And that, at least, was a victory worth celebrating. Spring arrived early that year, melting away the last vestiges of winter like hope dissolving fear. 6 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Jeremiah. 6 weeks during which the story of the Rourke family dispute had spread across the territory like wildfire. What had begun as a private legal matter had become a public discourse on the nature of family, the responsibilities of wealth, and the difference between what money could buy and what truly mattered. Mabel stood in the doorway of May's trading post, watching Will work with Samuel and Benjamin in the corral behind the building. The formal photograph she'd commissioned from the traveling photographer the week before sat on the table beside her, a portrait of their family as it truly was now, not bound by blood alone, but forged by choice, hardship, and love. Will stood behind her chair in the image, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, while the boys flanked her with the easy confidence of children who knew they were valued and secure. "Beautiful picture," May observed, joining her at the window. "Captures something important. It captures the truth," Mabel replied softly. "Whatever else happens, we have this moment, this certainty of what we mean to each other." The truth had indeed proven powerful. As Tom Mitchell and the other neighbors had promised, word of Jeremiah's actions had spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers, traders, and anyone who'd been touched by the story of a widow's fight to keep her children. Newspapers as far away as Denver had picked up the tale, and the public response had been overwhelmingly supportive of Mabel's cause. More importantly, the publicity had attracted the attention of people with the power to make a difference. Judge Morrison had launched a formal investigation into how he'd been deceived about Mabel's circumstances. The territorial governor had received dozens of letters from constituents expressing their outrage at Jeremiah's tactics. Even some of the politicians Jeremiah had hoped to influence had distanced themselves from his cause, unwilling to be associated with what the newspapers were calling the most callous display of greed in territorial history. But perhaps the most significant development had come from an unexpected source. 3 days earlier, a lawyer from Denver had arrived at the trading post, not representing Jeremiah, but carrying a letter from Thomas's former business partner, a man named Henry Caldwell, who'd moved to California after the consumption that claimed Thomas had also threatened his own health. "Mrs. Rourke," the lawyer had said, "Mr. Caldwell read about your situation in the San Francisco papers. He wanted you to know that he's prepared to testify about your late husband's true intentions. Regarding his children's upbringing, it turned out that Thomas had confided his fears about his family's attitude toward Mabel to his business partner, expressing his specific wishes that his children be raised with the values of hard work, compassion, and integrity, values he knew Jeremiah and Constance would never appreciate or foster. Papa really did plan for this," Samuel had said wonderfully when they'd read Caldwell's letter together. "He knew Uncle Jeremiah might cause trouble, so he made sure people would know what he really wanted for us." Now, as Mabel watched her boys learning to rope calves under Will's patient instruction, she marveled at how completely their lives had transformed. Not just their circumstances, though the legal battles had been resolved in their favor, with a judge ruling that the boys should remain with their mother and appointing an independent trustee to manage their inheritance until they came of age, but their understanding of what constituted wealth and security. "Mama, look!" Benjamin called excitedly from the corral. "I got the rope around the post 3 times in a row." "Wonderful, sweetheart," Mabel called back, her heart swelling with pride at the simple accomplishment that meant so much more than any amount of money in a bank account. Samuel, meanwhile, had progressed to working with actual calves, his natural ability with animals blossoming under Will's guidance. But more than skill, he was developing the patience and compassion that had characterized his father, qualities that would serve him well, whether he chose to be a rancher, a businessman, or anything else his heart desired. "The boys have a real future ahead of them," May observed, following Mabel's gaze, "not just because of their inheritance, but because of who they're becoming." "That's what Thomas always wanted," Mabel replied. "Not for them to be rich, but for them to be good men who used whatever resources they had to make the world a little better." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road, where a familiar figure was dismounting near the porch. Sheriff Thompson had become a regular visitor over the past weeks, keeping them informed about the legal proceedings and the various attempts by Jeremiah to salvage his position. "Ladies," the sheriff said as he entered, removing his hat with the courtesy that characterized all his interactions, "I bring news from Cheyenne." "Good news, I hope?" May asked, though the sheriff's relaxed expression suggested it was. "The best," Sheriff Thompson confirmed with a smile. "Judge Morrison has issued his final ruling. The boys remain with their mother, permanently and without conditions. Furthermore, Jeremiah Rourke has been ordered to pay court costs and has been formally censured for his misrepresentations to the court." The relief that flooded through Mabel was so intense she had to sit down. After months of uncertainty, of fearing that any day might bring new legal challenges or threats to her family's stability, the nightmare was finally over. "What about the inheritance?" she asked, though the money seemed almost secondary now to the security of keeping her children. "Managed by an independent trustee until the boys reach majority, with provisions for their education and welfare under your guidance," the sheriff explained. "You'll have access to reasonable funds for their upbringing, but the bulk of the estate will remain protected from any interested parties." It was exactly what Thomas would have wanted. His sons provided for but not spoiled, their future secured, but their character protected from the corrupting influence of too much wealth. Too soon. "And Jeremiah?" May asked, Sheriff Thompson's expression grew more serious. He's left the territory. Word is he's relocating his business interests to Chicago, where the scandal won't follow him so closely. Constance has filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Apparently even she was disturbed by the public reaction to his treatment of you and the boys. The news that Jeremiah's marriage had become another casualty of his greed seemed fitting somehow. A man who would try to steal children from their mother for money was perhaps not someone capable of maintaining loving relationships of any kind. Will he try again? Mabel asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Unlikely, the sheriff replied. The legal precedent is clear, and his reputation in this territory is beyond repair. Most importantly, the boys have made their choice known publicly and repeatedly. No court would force children to live with relatives they've explicitly rejected, in favor of their mother. As if summoned by their conversation, Will appeared in the doorway with Samuel and Benjamin, all three of them dusty from their work, but grinning with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Sheriff Thompson!" Samuel exclaimed, his face lighting up. "Did you see I roped a calf on my first try?" "I did indeed," the sheriff replied seriously. "That's fine work for someone your age. Your father would be proud." "Papa is proud," Benjamin said, with the absolute certainty of a child who'd never doubted his father's continued presence in his life. "He watches us all the time. Will says, Papa's the reason he knows so much about horses and cattle." Will's cheeks reddened slightly at this revelation of his private conversations with the boys, but his eyes held the warmth of a man who'd found unexpected purpose in honoring another. "Man's memory." "Speaking of Will," Sheriff Thompson said with a meaningful look at Mabel, "I understand congratulations might be in order." Mabel felt heat rise in her own cheeks as she glanced at Will, who was suddenly very interested in examining his rope. The proposal had come 2 weeks earlier, not with grand gestures or expensive rings, but during a quiet evening after the boys were asleep, when Will had simply taken her hands and asked if she thought they might build something lasting together. "Nothing's been decided yet," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Mama's being modest," Samuel announced with the devastating honesty of childhood. "She already said yes. Will's going to be our new papa, and we're going to have a real ranch of our own." "Samuel," Mabel protested, but she was laughing despite her embarrassment. "Well, it's true," Benjamin added loyally. "Will asked us if it was all right, and we said yes because we love him, and he loves us and Mama." The simple recounting of their family's expansion brought tears to Mabel's eyes. After months of fighting to keep her children together, the idea that their family was actually growing, becoming stronger and more complete, seemed almost too wonderful to believe. "When's the wedding?" May asked with obvious delight. "Next month," Will said, finally finding his voice. "Small ceremony, just family and close friends. The boys will be my best men." "Both of us?" Benjamin asked with excitement. "Both of you," Will confirmed. "Can't think of anyone I'd rather have standing beside me when I promise to love and protect your family." As the afternoon wore on and the sheriff departed with promises to visit again soon, Mabel found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They'd lost a ranch, but gained a home. They'd lost the security of wealth, but discovered the strength that came from earning their own way. They'd lost the protection of social position, but found something more valuable, a community of people who valued character over connections. Most importantly, they'd proved that love was indeed stronger than money, that chosen family could be more powerful than blood relations, and that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to the most precious destinations. That evening, as she tucked the boys into their beds for what she realized might be among the last times in this room above the trading post, Will had found land of his own, good grazing country where they could build the ranch he'd always dreamed of. Samuel asked a question that seemed to sum up everything they'd learned. "Mama, are we rich now?" Mabel looked around the simple room, taking in the quilt May had made for Benjamin's bed, the wooden horse that still sat on Samuel's nightstand, the photograph. that captured their new family in all its unconventional beauty. She thought about Will downstairs, planning their future with the same careful attention Thomas had once given to his dreams. She thought about May, who'd become the grandmother the boys had never had. She thought about the community that had rallied to their support simply because it was the right thing to do. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly, "we're richer than we ever imagined we could be, because of the money Papa left us." "No," Mabel replied, smoothing his hair with the gentle touch of a mother's love. "Because of the family we chose and who chose us back." As she prepared for sleep herself, Mabel reflected on the wisdom of her son's earlier declaration, that some things simply couldn't be bought. Love, loyalty, the security of being valued for who you were rather than what you owned. These were the true treasures, the real inheritance she could give her children. Outside, the spring wind whispered across the prairie, carrying the promise of new beginnings and fresh starts. Soon, they would leave this place that had been their sanctuary and begin the next chapter of their story. But wherever they went, whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. Not as the remnants of a broken family, but as the foundation of something new and strong and beautiful. The photograph on the table caught the lamplight one last time, its frozen moment of happiness, a testament to the power of love to create family from the most unlikely circumstances. It showed no mansion or fine clothes or symbols of wealth, just four people who'd found in each other everything they'd ever needed. And in the end, Mabel thought as sleep finally claimed her, that was worth more than all the silver in the mountains, all the gold in the banks, all the money that men like Jeremiah Rourke would ever understand. They were rich in the only currency that truly mattered, and no court order or legal document could ever take that away. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love was indeed the most powerful force in the world. But tonight, her family was together, safe and complete, and that was wealth beyond measure.